Good afternoon from London and good evening to our viewers in India. I'm John Ridding, the CEO of the Financial Times Group, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this first event in an important partnership between the Financial Times and the Indian Express, focused on India's place in the post-pandemic world. We seem to have arrived at an inflection point in the COVID-19 crisis, with the optimism generated by the rapid development of vaccines tempered by new variants of the virus and the accelerated spread of the pandemic. For economies and businesses already shaken to their core by the crisis, the path to recovery still seems set to be long, hard, and complex. The speed and shape of this global recovery will depend significantly on how quickly large and dynamic emerging markets like India can get back on their feet. India's fundamentals remain strong, with a giant consumer market, youthful population, rule of law, and a vibrant technology sector that is rapidly digitalizing finance and industry. Over the next 3.5 hours, we will hear from leading voices in policy, economics, and business on how these fundamentals can be freed to fulfill their potential and the measures that should be taken as a priority across both public and private sectors to sharpen India's competitiveness. At a time of divisions and tensions between several of the world's largest economies, the potential for India is all the greater. We are particularly honoured to have with us today for live keynote interviews India's Minister of Finance and Corporate Affairs, Nirmala Sitharaman, who will join us in 10 minutes or so, and the UK's Minister for Investment, Lord Grimstone, who will close the event with his insights on the UK's ambition for a closer trade relationship. Following this event, we will be expanding these agenda-setting discussions on India's global competitiveness to cover geopolitics and India's relations with China and the US on May the 20th. Further events focused on banking and finance and technology and sustainability will be held in September and November, all co-organised by FT Live, the FT Events Division, and the Indian Express. We are delighted to be launching this series of high-level events with the Indian Express, one of India's most respected news organisations, with millions of loyal readers, not just within India, but also overseas. Indeed, one of my last meetings in India before the travel curtain came down was with Anant Goenka, Executive Director of the Indian Express Group. And I was struck by our aligned vision on the media industry and broader macroeconomic, business and social trends that we and our readers face. India has always been of great importance to the Financial Times. More than 50 years ago, we posted correspondence to Delhi and Mumbai, and we have maintained bureaus there ever since. While our footprint is small and exclusive, tens of thousands of Indian readers come to ft.com weekly for our news, analysis, and opinions on global business, economics, and geopolitics. This partnership with the Indian Express is the first step in a new Financial Times initiative on India. We are examining new ways of reaching audiences there, both directly and via partnerships. And we plan to have more news about that soon. Now though, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over to Anand for his opening remarks. I hope you enjoy what promises to be a fascinating event.
Thank you, John. It's always such a pleasure to work and engage with you. I've always believed that the FT and the Indian Express Group are natural partners. Both our organizations share a formidable history of breaking stories that set the agenda, and we share a culture of investing in reporters with domain expertise that enable us to authoritatively question, analyze, and explain in an original and unique voice. Aside from the cultural fit of our two organizations, I think this endeavor to bring a global spotlight to key issues in India couldn't have come at a more relevant time. A post-Trump, post-pandemic global economy that's straddling between protectionism and globalization is now engaging with an industrious and entrepreneurial India. We're trying to be globally competitive, yet Atmanirbhar or self-reliant, while our ambitious workforce and our young and hungry consumers navigate the fast disrupting technologies and the debilitating and unpredictable virus. Our country's Honorable Finance Minister is not in an enviable position. She's been giving direction to the Indian economy now and has had many extremely challenging externalities come her way. She delivered a very progressive budget and has always been forthcoming to both media and industry, and so her address today will be closely watched. We also look forward to hearing from the UK's Investment Minister, Lord Grimstone. Our countries continue to share an extremely important trading relationship, and his interaction carries much relevance now in light of Prime Minister Johnson's second visit to India being cancelled. I'd like to quickly acknowledge the speakers who have made time to share their insights, the audience for joining us today, and our sponsors, Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation, MIDC, and One District, One Product, Uttar Pradesh. Thank you for all of you for joining us. I'll throw it over now to the Indian Express's National Affairs Editor, P. Vaidyanathan Iyer, and to the FT's Asia News Editor, Joseph Leahy, who will be driving the interaction with the Honorable Finance Minister. Thank you very much.
A warm welcome to everybody who has joined the Financial Times Indian Express series. We kick off today, and let me give a very warm welcome to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Uh, Co-moderating with me this session is Joe Leahy, who's the Asia News Editor of Financial Times and sits in Hong Kong. Joe has been in Mumbai for about 5 years between 2006 and 10. That was also a critical period when we had the terror attack as well as the 2008 crisis. Uh, Welcome, Joe. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us. Uh, it has been very gracious of you to take time off despite what we are seeing right now, a crisis kind of situation in India. A warm welcome to you. Joe,
Thanks very much, Vedi. Thank you, Minister, for the opportunity. My first question would be on in India's economy. It was losing momentum even before the pandemic, with 8 consecutive quarters of decelerating growth. What do you attribute this to?
Well, prior to the pandemic, when you're referring to the June 2019 till the budget was presented in 21, February 21, there was certainly a slowdown, shortage of liquidity. And therefore, when people needed money, they couldn't get it. We undertook a lot of measures to ensure that liquidity reaches people. In fact, much before what is called as a festive season in India, sometime between September and October before Diwali, we had ensured that banks, scheduled commercial banks, NBFCs, and others reached out with liquidity. So that year, we did have a specific problem of banks not being able to extend credit, which was sorted out. And early 2021, we did see clear signs of recovery. And with that, we went in for presenting a budget in February of 2021. But of course, within weeks after presenting that budget was COVID.
right, ma'am. The thing, your budget in February 2021 was, seen as a stellar budget. It was a reform-oriented budget. It was lauded across. Some of the key things which you announced in terms of reforms, including banking privatization, couple of banks, an insurance company. You went ahead with announcements on asset sale monetization. Now, when you look at the COVID-19 dashboard, ma'am, 3 lakh plus cases a day, 2,000 plus deaths a day. Uh, what worries you in terms of the ambitious plan that you set forth in the budget?
Vaidyanathan, whilst the situation of the second wave of the corona is challenging us on very many grounds. Supply of critical medicines, supply of required quantities of oxygen. And the government has been rapidly taking a lot of measures, inclusive of where necessary to import medical quality oxygen. We produce a lot of oxygen in this country, but still we need to import medical because the surge for oxygen has really gone up much more than one could have anticipated. And as regards critical medicines, we have again taken very many steps to make sure that their supply is addressed, issues related to supply are addressed. And I have been continuously engaging with industry leaders, business houses. Between Sunday and today, I have been talking with industry. And since the time Honorable Prime Minister took the position, and I'm very happy that he had mentioned it in so many words, that there shall not be a country-wide lockdown comparable to the one which we had in 2020. And the reason for that is in 2020, we as a country did not have adequate PPE kits. You won't be surprised, you know it. And we had ramped up production of PPE, ventilators, and also the way in which testing labs have been set up all over the country. Where they were just about 2, today we have more than 4,500 testing labs. Our capacity to test has gone up from somewhere, in hundreds to 15 lakh testings today. So the situation then and the situation today are very different. And above all, we have 2 vaccines already. So we don't think there is a need for an across-the-board lockdown. However, micro-level containment zones would be the thing that we would request the state governments to take up as their course. And many states have already clearly spoken that that might be the route they will take. Even with that said, there are certain pockets in which the numbers and the surge is so significant that, as in Delhi, we've gone in for a week-long sort of lockdown, which affects the movements of goods. Also, industry suffers because of the movement of raw materials get affected. So I think it's a bit too early for me to think, and this is what I've also got as impression from industry, too early for us to think that this is going to affect us beyond this week or further. We'll have to wait and watch a bit, and then we'll take a call. But at the moment, activities are all happening. Industry is still on its recovery mode. And therefore, I wouldn't rush to think that this will hurt us if we are able to coordinate better, as much as people would have us believe.
A quick complimentary question, ma'am. About the reforms that you announced in the budget. Do you think they will be on course?
Strangely, I must tell you, this morning we've had my routine day starts with the meeting with the secretaries of my ministry, and also with the secretaries of corporate affairs, which is also something which I look after. This morning when we met up, the mood and also the way in which we had planned out for disinvestment, setting up the DFI, looking at the asset reconstruction companies, everything is on course. And in fact, the message from the secretaries was that we are going as smoothly as it was before, and therefore we don't suspect that that will be affected. In fact, even if there were 1 or 2 centers where lockdowns were to happen, they may not affect our disinvestment program or our program to set up with the DFI or any other institutional reforms that we have announced in the budget.
Minister, just to switch to foreign investment, if the government really does want to encourage foreign investment, how does it explain the protracted disputes with some of India's biggest foreign investors, such as Vodafone and Can? How do you also explain some of the unpredictable shifts in economic policies, such as the recent tariff hikes?
First, I'll touch upon the tariff hikes that you're talking about. I have spent quite some time myself looking at the tariff issues. The items on which the hikes have happened are very consistent with what we have laid before ourselves in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat. In that, where India has a capacity to produce, and if they are end consumer products, not raw materials, not intermediary goods, if they are end consumer products which we manufacture in this country, we would rather have our capacity strengthened. And as regards tariff, they are only measures to not stop entirely, but make it a bit more expensive so that it gets discouraged in those goods only. But we have not stopped or we have not raised any tariff on inputs of raw materials or intermediary goods. So our tariff related issues are very clearly laid before everybody, and we don't intend being regressive at all in this. That is one thing. The second is about you are absolutely right in raising the issue of Vodafone and Kane. I must tell you, I've had only a few days ago a meeting with one of the representative of Kane, and we were talking once earlier too, around early February. They had come over and had a meeting with the then finance secretary. We belong to a party, and Prime Minister and former Finance Minister himself had very clearly said we don't believe in retrospective taxation. However, when issues are taken to an international arbitration body where that issue is one aspect, but beyond that, the arbitrations questioning India's sovereign right to tax is a matter of concern for us. And to that limited extent of bodies questioning Indian sovereign right to taxation, we are worried that it sets a real wrong precedent about countries and taxing authorities and the taxation powers of country. On the issue of Kane, as I said, I have had one meeting. Earlier, they have had a meeting with our team, with the finance secretary. I want to see how best we can sort this out.
Can I just follow up on self-reliance? You've said before that you want India to be fully integrated into global supply chains, but the idea of being self-reliant and globally integrated for some people is contradictory. Can you explain how you can have this seeming contradiction?
I can understand if you tell me that there could be a contradiction. Maybe to an extent it does. I'll have to be candid on that. To the extent that India's capacity to produce and be competent enough to be able to take on the world has been severely restricted in the last decade because of such practices which have hurt us. I'm not elaborating on it. But at the same time, I think Indian manufacturing has been hurt on very many grounds, particularly on matters which have bulk usage in this country, not those specified things which are, let us say, high-end technology, those which we don't have the wherewithal to produce. None of that. Even basic goods. We've been flooded by unjustified dumping, as a result of which many of our small and medium manufacturing units have been taken to severe task and they are just not able to survive. And Indian economy depends to a large extent on our MSMEs. Many of them actually produce goods which are absolutely relevant for our own day-to-day consumption. Even they have been eroded because of the dumping. So as a government, we have taken a call that MSMEs need some support, particularly if they are producing those goods which are essential for our day-to-day lives and which are consumer items. They're not, downstream industries. They're not industries which are producing intermediary goods. And that is why when we say Atmanirbhar, I repeatedly say we don't look inwards. We're not shutting the Indian economy. We are clearly saying we have to play on our strengths. Our strengths has been labor-intensive small and medium units which produce a lot of things for us. If they are completely washed out, and we are going to, for those items, depend on imports, and imports which are absolutely dumped cheap, dirt cheap on our markets, we need to take some corrective course. And that's one thing which is very clearly Atmanirbhar.
Ma'am, very quickly on, in the second wave, we are seeing again companies facing problems, of repayment of debt. Already the banking sector was not in great shape before the pandemic or after the first wave of the pandemic. Do you see that there could be a demand and need for a second moratorium or another moratorium? Also, do you have any specific policy measures for the banking sector?
Vaidyanathan, as I said earlier, the pandemic is something which all state governments are addressing, however perfectly or not so perfectly, and all of us are helping each other. At this stage, I think our focus is to address the immediate requirement for saving lives and also making sure that vaccination is ramped up. You are aware that from 1st of May, vaccination is going to be open for everybody 18 plus. In the meanwhile, in the government hospitals, we are ensuring vaccination is available for free, particularly so that the lower end, in the sense for those who really can't afford to pay, migrant workers, the poor, the needy, all of them will have to be covered with the vaccination which is ongoing. We are going to also very clearly giving back a lot of attention, which is what we have done in 2020, for ramping up on testing, tracing, and treating people. The protocol, of course, of social distance, masking up, and everything else will be kept up and followed. So we are paying attention to all this. The economy is kept open even today. Yes, there are part lockdowns here, some other place, but hopefully they'll all be, once the chain is broken, they'll get back to being what normally they should be. So in the context of lockdown not really having been imposed, however, lives being in difficulty because of the pandemic, I would first focus on these measures and then see how best the economy will have to be addressed. Although I'm monitoring the economy in a very detailed fashion on an everyday basis, at the moment I don't have a plan as yet.
Minister, in the midst of the first wave, you announced a 20 lakh crore stimulus, 10% of GDP. How much fiscal space do you have now to intervene and to support the economy and its people?
Well, I think, strictly speaking, last year too, we had extended as much as possible because it was important for me to pull up the economy. We've been absolutely open-minded about ensuring that if it requires a bit of borrowing, we shall do that, and we've borrowed substantially. Even this year, we've announced a borrowing calendar. I've made it clear that I will not hesitate to front load as much as is required. In fact, that facility is being extended even to the states whose borrowing limits normally have been at 3% of their GSDP. We've extended it further with some conditions so that the reform measures are also made part and parcel of this, the pandemic-related challenge. We are taking that challenge up in the process of reforming, so that people have one ration card all over the country, so that they can get their food, which is being provided anywhere, and so on. Many other measures like reforming the electricity distribution and so on. But with or without that, we've already given permission to the states to be able to use as much as they want, even at the very beginning. We are only 20 days into this new financial year, but still we've allowed states to go ahead borrowing as much as they would want. And we recognize now they have a issue of also buying the vaccines. So the long and short of what I want to tell you is front loading all that borrowing which is being made for the sake of capital expenditure, investing in infrastructure building, and making sure states also get a bit more flexible on borrowing for investing in their capital expenditure.
Yeah, ma'am, we have very little time to go, but there are many audience questions. If I may just uh, uh, ask one or two from the questions from the audience. One question is about what steps are you taking for reviving urban unemployment?
I think a few things which have been announced as regards workers who can get enrolled into companies which had first of all removed them back again. We've incentivized them. We've also said if there are companies which want to expand, we give them, their contribution of the Provident Fund. So when they take a new employee, they get that benefit. And this is available for all the EPFO registered organizations. Other than that, the PLI schemes, Vaidyanathan, you're aware, 4 tranches of PLI have been cleared by the cabinet. They're huge incentivizing programs for production, and they are, many of them, such items which have a lot of labor going into them. So they are all going to, whether it is establishing mega textile parks, which is not the PLI linked, but other than the PLI linked sectors, you have mega textile park also. These are directly tailored in such a way that labor intensive sectors will immediately get the benefit to launch, expand, and bring in newer capacities. That's going to have a direct bearing on employment in the urban areas.
Just another question from the audience. Minister, what role will FTAs play in the post-pandemic recovery, free trade agreements with the EU or other countries?
They will definitely be an important element. I have spent some time with the Minister of Commerce and with the External Affairs Minister. We place a lot of importance on the trade agreements with the United States of America, with the European Union. I know the FTA with the European Union has waited for a very long time. Both sides have had their difficulty. Whether it was the negotiation getting stalled before Brexit, post that, whether it was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was much touted but which couldn't happen, and post that Brexit actually happening and Britain getting out of European Union. So there's been one or the other reason beyond India's control, which had procrastinated us getting an agreement through. Now, therefore, I can see the Commerce Minister spending a lot of planning time on getting something quickly. You call it as a quick low-hanging fruit approach first, and going for a full-fledged agreement a bit later, or one agreement, but which can be happening sometime later this year. So this priority on trade agreement with the European Union is absolutely on the top. We love to have it.
Yeah, ma'am, one last question from the audience. How is the energy transition to sustainable fuels in coherence with India's quest for a $5 trillion economy?
Energy-related issues, climate-related issues, I'm very proud to say that the Prime Minister has kept it on the top of his agenda. The recent report submitted to the authorities on the climate-related commitments which India made in Paris in COP21, I'm extremely happy to say that we've already achieved the 2% emission target, and we are also one of those countries which have fulfilled many of the commitments which we have given. Probably there are only about 7 or 8 countries. We are one among them. And also on the renewable energy, the emphasis which is being given on the solar energy and the kind of achievement targets that we've been meeting, the milestones which have been met by India, is something which is good news for India. We have shown that if there is political will, and the support of the people, we are able to very quickly transform into a solar energy hub, if anything. And to produce the parts which are required for the cells and also for the generation of solar energy. We've given quite a lot of incentive for manufacturing those parts, the cells and the whatever films that are required, and therefore there's a lot of encouragement being given for solar energy. And also, you would probably remember in July 2019 budget had made a commitment that we shall move away from those archaic thermal units, which are not at all eco-friendly. Coal, first of all, is not. But even so, some very old plants, which are very inefficient, we have made a commitment that we will gradually close them down. So we are very committed on to this cause.
Right.
Minister, we've run out of time, but I want to thank you very much for this very informative session. Thank you, Vaidi. I want to remind everyone also that the session will be available on demand for a minimum of 30 days on our event website also. Our next session will start in 5 minutes, and it will be moderated by the FT's South Asia Bureau Chief, Amy Casman. She will be discussing the Minister's comments further there and looking more broadly at the Indian economy. And Amy will be in the company of the government's Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramanian, the CEO of MIDC, Dr. Ambalagan, JP Morgan's Jahangir Aziz, and Rohini Malkani of DBRS Morningstar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Kasman, and I'm the South Asia Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, and I welcome you from here in Delhi. We're here to talk about India's economy and how it can regain sustained economic growth. Even before the pandemic hit, India's economy had been losing momentum with growth slowing, and it suffered a huge shock as a result of the pandemic. Many people had expected a big bounce back of growth this year, but now with India being hit by a ferocious second wave of the pandemic, many of those forecasts are also being called into question. The disruption is likely to compound pre-existing challenges, including banking system weakness, tepid investment, and soft demand. But the Modi government has announced many profound structural reforms, including privatization of banks, and has talked about trying to integrate India more deeply into global supply chains while also boosting its self-reliance. To talk about what that means for the Indian economy, I've got a fantastic panel. I'd like to welcome you all to this session. I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions at any time through the Q&A box to the right of your screen. We're going to take as many audience questions as we can in the last 10 minutes. And you're also encouraged to please share your thoughts and tweets on social media using Post-Pandemic India. Before I turn to the full panel, I'd like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Anbalagan, the head of the Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation, which is our lead sponsor for this event. And before we talk to the full panel about the macroeconomic challenges, we're going to have a perspective from somebody who's right on the ground in the States, trying to make India and his state more attractive for and more business friendly for investment. So Dr. Anbalagan, first of all, thank you so much for your support of our event and also for being here today with us. I'd like to ask you how you see the role of the state and what Maharashtra is trying to do to create a more enticing investment climate for businesses.
Thank you, Amy, and a very good evening to all, to my esteemed colleagues from Government of India, my eminent panelists, friends from media, and also members of the audience present at the forum today. At the outset, my gratitude to Indian Express and FT Live for hosting the event. While ensuring that the lives of millions are saved, we as a whole must also ensure that their livelihoods are also protected. So the country as a whole and also the states are continuing to expand the economy. So when we talk of India and its growth story, not alone just restricting with the pandemic in any genera, it's totally incomplete with states like Maharashtra. And there are major giants, of course. The state has its own benefits. I would say the largest subnational economy with close to almost $500 million gross state domestic product. And we have almost contributed 15% to the country, and also FDI cumulative is almost 30%. Almost a very good export capabilities, where almost 1/5 of the export goes from Maharashtra. And of course, Mumbai, the financial capital, is here in Maharashtra. The state also has a diverse base of sectors, and even with pandemic, it could maintain the maximum, I would say, supply chain, so that global value chains and also the value chains in across the country is not affected. The state, so this all has given us very good tangible benefits in key sectors, be it automobiles, electronics, food processing, gems and jewelry, chemicals and pharmaceuticals. If we think of the state contributes somewhere around 20 to 24% all these sectors. Emerging sectors like toys, industry 4.0 also are going to play a dominant role. And when we talk of FDI and also during COVID pandemic, drugs and pharmaceuticals, where the state also is a very dominant player with almost close to 25% of FDI is from pharmaceuticals. And the country's top 9 pharmaceutical companies are also based out of the state, and Serum Institute, which every day is in news, is also based out of Pune. Coming to the system as a state, how the state or the subnational economy should function. So the enabling ecosystem has to be there. We should be supported by visionary leadership and progressive and dynamic policies. I think that should take care of what exactly the demands and needs of the industry growing. And you need to have a strong demand markets, which of course the state has. The state is trying to achieve $1 trillion economy, which is also going to be one of the main challenges for our $5 trillion economy for our nation. So the sectors like I would say IT, ITS, ESDM, data center are going to play a dominant role in coming times. Lastly, we need to also have a strong infrastructure. Basically, transportation infrastructure, port-led development, these things are going to change. The country is bestowed with a long coastline, and a state like Maharashtra has almost close to 700 plus a kilometer of coastline. And here, particularly if you take up a state like Maharashtra, more than 40 billion USD is being invested in various development projects, be it Maharashtra Prosperity Corridor, which is trying to connect Nagpur to Mumbai, Mumbai Trans Harbour Link, and also metro rail projects in Mumbai, Pune, Nagpur, and also as of late, it's also Nasik, Navi Mumbai International Airport, and also you have a national industrial corridor development. Country is also pitching in NACDC, bringing in like a smart industrial townships, be it Maharashtra, be it TN, like you have a like Bangalore, Chennai corridor, Mumbai, Delhi corridor. You also have a it in like Gujarat, Maharashtra. These states are going to play a very dominant role. Secondly, we have like a strong port network as a state as a whole. We have a JNPT, Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, which handles 52%. That way, Western Coast, which is connected with like Middle East and also to the Western world, is going to play a very dominant role. Be it like maybe a crude oil development, also maybe a petrochemical, pharmaceutical, food processing. We are going to have. So port-led development is another area which state is also looking at, where we are going to have almost close to 30,000 acres earmarked in like close to Mumbai metropolitan region and places like Jaigarh, which also has a port. So these are coming up. And the state also, most of the states as a country, we have industrial development corporation like Maharashtra as one of the best and maybe functional and efficient nodal agency for industrial development, which I'm the chief executive officer of that organization. It has a strong record for close to 6 decades and owns one of the largest industrial land banks spreading across 250,000 acres. And we also developed close to 289 industrial clusters where sector-specific clusters are also need of the work because chemical, food parks, textile parks, they need even pharmaceutical, they need different types of environmental infra to support that. So the states also should look at sector specific when we are comparing like it's like one country we are like shifting from a dependence on a particular single destination for any supply chain, then you're also going to operate at much economy of scale, and you are going to operate at, you need to compare with Southeast Asian nations. They are like Vietnam, Indonesia, even Bangladesh, Malaysia, they're all competitors. So state also should be competing that. So MADC operates at much higher magnitude with like its road network, sewage treatment plants, ETP, and we operate one of the largest water supply network, almost close to 2,500 million liters a day we supply, and where 60% we supply to domestic and 40% to the industry. So with all this, I think really the state is going to be like integral part of the country's economic growth in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ambalgan. One very quick question before I open it to the panel, and that is, how do you see the self-reliant, the state's role in the self-reliant India campaign, the Atmanirbhar Bharat of, just very briefly, if I can?
See, the self-reliant India or Atmanirbhar Bharat is based on, like I would say, 5 key pillars. It's like it doesn't leave any stone, I think. Economy, infrastructure, technology, demography, and demand. And it has included all the 24 champion sectors, and where the union and state coordination is also being taken care of with empowered group of secretaries, and also you have a PDCs, project development cells. On the top of it, you have a production linked incentive schemes. So the states need to realign, if at all, they should be tandem with the government of India, union government's plan. The state, of course, Maharashtra has almost aligned closely with the national champion sectors, including like Industry 4.0, textiles, medical devices, agro clusters, be it few, even like off late gym equipment, toys, all that. So this PLI scheme has been announced, total of 13 sectors. Though I would say still as like a state, we need to stretch a bit beyond to have a more budgetary allocations for those sectors, because when you compare with like particularly in textile and other things, we need to have more because we have a strong potential. So Maharashtra has aligned all the policies close to PLI structures with like we are coming up with electronic manufacturing cluster is one thing, and also the pharmaceutical city, the bulk drug park is another thing. The government of India is also supporting a medical devices park. So these things are going to make really a change, and of course it's going to be really make the dream of becoming Atmanirbhar and aims to contribute the era of growth in the coming years. And state will be, of course, allowed to be part of with that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think now it's time at this point to bring in the rest of our panelists to have a big look at the real challenges facing India and the situation for the economy. I'm very, very honored to be joined by KV Subramaniam, the Chief Economic Advisor, Jahangir Aziz of JP Morgan, and Rohini Mulkani of DBS Morningstar. Jahangir, if I could, I'd like to start with you and ask you,
Sure.
The Indian economy was slowing significantly for quite some time prior to the shock of the pandemic. To what do you attribute the reasons for this slowdown? And yes, that's the start.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone for the invitation. We have somewhat of a non-consensus view about the drive. If you look around, there's this entrenched belief that all that happened since 2016 was, a consequence of a series of unfortunate events that happened one after the other. We started with the demonetization of 2016, followed by the implementation of GST, and was the bad loans, bad banks, and NBF's liquidity problems. Problem with this narrative is that it has almost little to do with reality. So if you try to date back, when was the last peak of India's growth? That was in the fourth quarter. I'm talking about calendar year, fourth quarter of 2015, first quarter. You can take, and it was like 6-9 months before, India was hit by the demonetization shock. So I think this narrative that gets entrenched in the market doesn't really hold up. Our view is that what happened to India is a structural change that has taken place, and it's simply the reversal of the drop that propelled India to legit growth in the second half of 2000. So if you go back there, India, turns out to be just like another emerging market economy that lashed onto the globalization bandwagon. If you look at growth from 2004 onwards, it's almost entirely investment and exports. India's exports jumped from around 12% of GDP to about 26, 27% of GDP, but towards the end of the in the beginning of the global financial crisis, and that's backed with a massive surge in investment in the corporate sector. Consumption, supposed growth that everybody touts about, that actually fell every year in that entire period of time. India got hit by the global financial crisis. The world recovered. India recovered, and then something happened to the globalization model in the world, which is basically that global trade started to slow down. This is from 2012 onwards, and with that, Indian exports slowed down, and with that, corporate investment and investment slowed down. So, none of this is rocket science. All you have to do is to draw two lines. One, which is exports to GDP ratio of India and investment to GDP ratio in India. And there is virtually little daylight between the two lines. And I'm talking about these in, quarterly frequency. So essentially, the view that we have is that India, like every other emerging market country except China, depended overly on globalization and global trade. Global trade has changed, and we can talk about what are the drivers of global trade that has changed. These are, again, structural drivers that have changed global trade. And India's lost that big, huge driver of its growth. And it hasn't, over the last 10 years, either through reforms or through policy changes, tried to find out a new driver of growth, which is essentially domestic demand. And that's where we are right now. That's where we were in 2016. Those other things, worsened. Other things being demonetization and GST and liquidity shocks simply worsened the situation, but they weren't the key drivers of India's slowdown. The key drivers of India's slowdown is that India, like all other emerging market countries except China, which is the only country that has actually changed policies and changed reforms to rebalance growth rather than simply to increase growth. That's the only country that has an independent driver of growth today among emerging market countries. India is just like any other emerging market countries in the same throes and same problems like the rest of the world. So that's the way we are looking at things.
Rohini, do you agree with that analysis?
So basically, thanks, Amy, and basically, and thanks everyone for kind of joining in. So I think what basically Jahangir has said, like he has kind of spoken about like how exports help the India story, but I think there's also a little bit of truth on basically the other drivers, because as we did see the slowdown in growth from 8.2% in FY17 to 4% in basically FY20. So we did also have consumption and investment slowing down. In the case of consumption, we saw that basically rural demand was weak because of various disruptions to the informal economy. In the case of the urban sector, it was also unable to basically increase loans, get loans. And as far as basically the financial stresses were concerned, this kind of impacted, this basically did kind of, impact monetary policy transmission, and despite RBI cutting rates and basically injecting liquidity. So I would say that we've got to kind of take into account all these three factors that were there, and which was kind of responsible for the growth slowing down from 8.2% in FY17 to 4% in FY20, just before COVID hit the economy.
And Mr. Subramaniam, what's your view? Sir, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, thank you very much, Amy, and very, very good evening or good morning to viewers wherever they are. And thanks to Financial Times and Indian Express for having me on this panel. Let me start off by first mentioning the points that I agree with my fellow panelists, and then dig deeper. What is important here is, especially with macroeconomics, every variable is both a cause and an effect. And therefore, it is really important to disentangle and get to causality, which is what scholarly work tries to do. I'll point to the economic survey of 2018-19, where we actually did that, disentangling the the cause and the effect, and pointed out how if you look at the last century and look at countries that grew at 5% plus in real terms for at least a decade, that's a sample we looked at. And then we try to disentangle the fact that variables like investment actually are both a cause and effect, because investment leads to productivity, therefore it's a cause, but investment also responds to consumption or anticipated consumption, therefore it's an effect. By disentangling the the cause and effect relationships, what we showed through very careful evidence is that when you look at these countries that grew at 5% plus for at least a decade, they all grew because of private investment. And it was private investment that eventually affects productivity, creates jobs in the economy, puts money in the hands of people, and then in the second round effects, anticipating such consumption, then investment increases, and that's how that virtuous cycle proceeds. Now, let me bring in the data to actually to talk about this. If you look at the gross fixed capital formation in the economy, gross fixed capital formation had peaked, just before the global financial crisis, has come down secularly since then, in the 2020 economic survey, we showed that was primarily because of the problems in the financial sector. Here it is important to understand the fundamentals of the economy. We are a young population where actually, when growth happens, people require, to consume, and therefore consumption will go up. So it's not as if the fundamentals of the economy have changed. And importantly, if you look at the business cycles in India, the quarters that it persists, about 12 quarters expansion, 8 quarters is actually the decline. So even from a business cycle phenomenon, I don't agree with Jahangir that fundamentals of the economy have changed. because you can look at it from the business cycle literature. You could also look at it from this, digging deeper and looking at what is it that drives the macroeconomy. And here I must point out, if you look at the, just take your GDP, the components of GDP, consumption and investment account for almost 90% of the GDP. Exports actually, or net exports, are much less. Exports, if you just focus on that as well, the influence of that on gross fixed capital formation is not very high. So this is again not rocket science, and Jahangir, I'm sure, understands. But as you can see, the numbers themselves suggest that this theory that it's actually that fundamentals have changed is not quite right. So let me mention that it was actually the financial sector problems that led to a decline in the fixed in investment in the economy as reflected in the gross fixed capital formation. It also impacted productivity. If you look at the incremental capital output ratio and you track that, because of several bad assets, non-performing assets, etc., productivity declined, and that is also reflected in the ICOR. So it was actually the financial sector problems that led to this. And if you look at evidence actually, and people like Atif Mia and Ahmed Sufi at Chicago actually have done research showing that whenever a slowdown or a recession happens in any economy and it starts from the financial sector, it's a very long drawn. The impact compared to the origins coming from the real economy, when it comes from the financial sector, the problems are long drawn. And therefore the key here is actually that macro fundamentals have not changed. It is the overhang of the financial sector and the fact that typically the average loan is 5 years long. So, bad loans that are given, you get to discover them only actually, after 5 years. And this was in the previous government, all the crony lending, which has actually created this overhang. Last point I want to mention, because of the preamble with which you started about the slowing down of the economy before the pandemic. While there was a slowdown like this, what you need to look at, when you look at the Q4 numbers, Q4 of last year, you will see that it is a decline. But I think the story is not there actually. When you have to unpack that. The fact that pandemic hit India last March, and if you look at all the high frequency indicators, and my office tracks almost 60 of them, they were all peaking till February. And I can, based on that analysis, tell you that if the pandemic counterfactually had hit in the month of April, for instance, our growth for Q4 would have been 6% plus. So we would have actually indeed reversed this pattern. And that is important to understand, not just look at the top line number, but open the hood, if you will, of the car and really look at what is going on. So I think this is important to understand that, to summarize, the decline was primarily because of the overhang of the financial sector, and the policies that were being brought in after July actually started showing their impact when COVID struck. So, of course, I think we can talk more about it. India is the only country that has really looked to change the narrative, convert, the crisis into an opportunity, and has brought in seminal changes in the way we think about the economy. Of course, we can discuss about that as we go forward.
We would definitely like to discuss that. And thank you very much for that very interesting perspective. You're suggesting that India was actually poised for a big growth rebound before the shock of the virus hit. I'd like to maybe follow up with that.
Amy, let me correct, actually. I wasn't saying big growth. I was saying actually, that change. I said about 6% plus. Big growth for India is 8% plus. 6% plus is not big growth for India.
Okay. That, in other words, the shock of the pandemic weighed on those last quarter results before the full shock hit. So I'd like to come and ask you then, I think there was a lot of talk just a few months ago, I mean, we all know it who are here, that there was a feeling that the worst was over and India was poised for a quick and significant rebound in growth with the pandemic, feeling like maybe it had been behind the country in February. And, there was a few heady weeks, which I think anybody here felt that the worst is over, life is going to come back. And of course, we've all been smacked with a very unpleasant reality that hasn't really happened. So I'd like to ask you what scars you think this pandemic is going to leave on the Indian economy. Once this wave, I don't know when that'll be, but once it recedes, what's going to be left on the shore of, what's the detritus that's going to be left on the beach? What are the scars that the Indian economy is going to bear? Or do you think that actually not much and we're just going to bounce right back, as soon as these cases decline? What do you think is going to be the long-term, medium-term legacy of this serious health crisis that we're now going through?
Firstly, Amy, I think we have to acknowledge that it's not just India. Every other country, including the United States, UK, Germany, many countries have gone through a second wave. So predicting that second wave actually has been a real problem for epidemiological researchers. And not only India, every other advanced economy has also gone through a second wave. So India is basically just, for India, the second wave has come at a much later rate. And it is true that a lot of people did say that we have reached herd immunity by looking at the numbers. If there's one learning from this pandemic, I think it's that, predictions are very, very difficult to make. So now let me talk about the second part of your question, the impact of the pandemic. Let's look at the first wave itself. I had mentioned at the end of when the first quarter numbers had come, by looking at the high frequency indicators, that there was a V-shaped recovery in the macroeconomic indicators that was on. And from September until March, we actually saw that manifesting. I think the best evidence of that, of course, you can look at indicators like the Purchasing Managers Index, but the best revealed preference is taxes. Look at personal taxes, corporate taxes, consumption taxes, the GST, the way that came back, because that is eventually money talking, and those came back very, very strongly, which actually bears out the fact that there was a strong recovery that was on. I think from the first wave, when we were in a situation of unknown unknowns, we've now moved to a situation of known unknowns. There is still uncertainty, but it's known unknowns. Once the second wave is on, actually what we would all want to get to is a situation of known knowns, of course. But I think there is an important difference compared to the first wave. The second wave is actually, there is a lot more knowledge about how to handle it. For instance, it's unlikely that India will go into a national lockdown. There's been a lot of learning that has happened. So I do think, given the predictions that are being made by many epidemiological researchers, that the pandemic should not extend beyond May. Based on that, we've done some internal assessments. I think that the impact actually may not be very large. But of course, as I said, I think all of us economists actually have to say all these things with enormous dose of humility, because not only in India, but in every other country, predicting the pandemic has been extremely difficult.
Jahangir, do you agree that the scars or the impact of the pandemic shock and the disruption that we've seen over the last year and is continuing here now will not be very large?
Probably not. So let me just go back to the way we are looking at the pandemic. So first of all, I agree with KB that if there is to be a V-shaped recovery, and that probably is over. One of the reasons why we in India, we struggle with this idea of V-shaped recovery is because we insist on using a 30-year-old antiquated system of measuring growth, which is on year-on-year growth numbers. No large economy in the world does that. So if you shift to what the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world does, which is looking at quarter-on-quarter growth numbers, when you look at, for example, US growth or UK growth, these are, on a quarterly basis, not on a year-on-year basis. Then in the second quarter of last year, second quarter meaning second quarter calendar, last year, India's growth fell compared to that in the first quarter by 25%. And if you look at what happened in the third and the fourth quarter, in the third quarter, India's growth jumped by about 22%, and the fourth quarter, it jumped by about 6%, making India in the third and the fourth quarter of last year to be the fastest growing country in the world, not among emerging market countries, but in the world. And somehow this phenomenon seemed to have escaped almost everyone associated with the Indian economics. What has happened since then is that, the economy has continued to improve. but at a much slower pace. So in the fourth quarter, we got 6% growth rate. We are expecting in the first quarter of calendar year, which is the fourth quarter of the fiscal year, about 4% growth rate. And then, comes the big second wave shock. In terms of, how the shock is going to pan out, I know and I agree again with KB that almost every economist is supposed to be epidemiologists these days. We are not epidemiologists or we are not public health experts. It is very difficult for us to predict how the second wave is going out. But, most likely there will be scarring in the second quarter of this year. We are looking at about four again on a quarter-on-quarter basis. And even if there is a very mild quarterly recovery, and we have very modest recovery in the rest of the year, which is just about 1% per quarter for the remaining 3 quarters of the fiscal year, on a year-ago basis, which is what everybody seems to be focused on India will still clock about 11.5% 2021 growth compared to 2020. So these growth numbers sound large, but in reality, at the end of 2022, level of GDP will still be about 8 to 9 percentage points lower than what the pre-pandemic path would have been, and we have a very modest pre-pandemic path. We expected India to grow around 6% average, not the 7% aspirational rate that most people thought to use. But even with the very modest pre-pandemic path, the 6% average growth rate, India's level of GDP is going to be down by about 8, 9 percentage points. If you have 2 years of that kind of income shock, 2020 and 2021, then chances are that there is going to be serious damage to both household balance sheets and with SME balance sheets. The point being that India is now looking at emerging fault lines that have emerged and have become entrenched and probably worsened by this pandemic and by the second wave. This is in addition to all the problems that India had in the pre-pandemic period, which probably also worsened. And in addition to the massive shock to household and SME balance sheet, there is other imbalances that are emerging in the economy. We know that the biggest decline that has taken place in India has been in the services sector. We also know that women labor force is one of the largest contributions to the services employment, unlike manufacturing. We also know from history, not from India because India doesn't have the data, but from other countries, that women's labor takes a much longer time to respond to shocks, which means that labor participation, particularly among women, is going to be significantly slower to recover than male participation. So there's the other imbalances that we are opening up in terms of gender gap in employment. And the third that I would point out is that if you look at last quarter's GDP number, overall government consumption rose very strongly. But if you split it between center and state, the state government consumption fell or state government spending fell, whereas central government spending went up. So we have 3 different sets of imbalances that have emerged and are becoming more entrenched as we go through the year, and in addition to all of the problems that we had in the pre-pandemic. The problem that I have is that neither fiscal policy nor monetary policy is not that important in this case, but neither fiscal policy nor reforms are addressing or are even aware, at least from my reading of it, aware of these emerging imbalances, these emerging fault lines. So, in terms of the impact of the pandemic, we really do not think that 2021-22 is going to be a bad year. You are going to get a double-digit growth in 2021. What we are really concerned about is the fact that medium-term growth, because of the problems that were not addressed or were half addressed and remained, remained on the ground from the pre-pandemic time, and that includes what KB has talked about in terms of the financial sector. Also, Rohini talked about the financial sector problems. In addition to that, we now have this problem that NPLs will rise very sharply this time around, and when we have damaged balance sheets, it takes a very long time for the economy to repair. And coupled with that, we now have widening gender gap in the employment market, in the labor market, and we have this very strange center-state divergence in spending. Our view is that the near term, 21-22, isn't going to be as bad. If you go down that much, you have to come up that much. That's not a big deal. It's the medium term where we are seriously concerned about what India's medium term growth will look like.
Rohini,
Maybe
do you share Jahangir's? Oh, sorry.
Can I respond to these?
Very briefly, please, because it's. Can I come back to you actually? Can I let Rohini say whether she shares those concerns about India's medium-term prospects, and what do you see as the growth outlook for India past this year, but in the medium term?
Okay, thanks a lot, Amy. Thanks, Jahangir and KV. So I think we need to kind of separate it between what's happening near term, what is the the impact of scarring, and then kind of look at what are India's medium term growth prospects. So following a tumultuous 2020, as we've noted, where the first quarter growth kind of dipped 24% and the full year contracted 8%, India is poised for a sharp cyclical recovery. Now, pre the second wave, we had growth estimates being in the 10.5% to 12% range, and now because of the fast and furious wave of the second wave, we are seeing estimates being basically cut. Now, while this is clearly a public health concern, similar to what we've seen across the world, the impact of the second wave is likely to be a bit limited, and that's mainly because of the fact that the lockdowns or the restrictions are more localized. Secondly, people as well as companies have learned to adapt. They've learned to kind of work around the virus. And thirdly, we do have a big solution, and that's the vaccine. Now, having said that, everyone's talking about uncertainty. Yes, so I think the key point to note is that there are downside risks. The pace of the recovery, even if you're talking about 10-12% growth, is going to depend upon how the virus evolves. When does the second wave peak? And secondly, and more importantly, is how fast can we see the vaccination program going on? So that's like the immediate near term. Now, as you were talking about scarring, I do agree with basically Jahangir. Clearly, what we have seen that and it's not just in India; it's across the world. In fact, if you look at the IMF's latest forecast, they are looking at global growth this year being 6%, next year 4.4%. But they've said that the recovery is it's going to be uneven, it's unequal, and it's far from complete. It's uneven. Why? Because it depends on how much stimulus different countries have done. Two, it depends upon the structure of the economy. Like say for India, in India's case, it was largely an informal economy. And thirdly, it also depends, upon the starting point where we saw India's growth, pre-COVID was a 10-year low. It's also been unequal. We've seen that, and this is not just in India, it's across the world. We've seen in the case of manufacturing, that's kind of picked up, but say services has lagged behind. Now, and even within services, we're seeing that sort of, difference take place. We've seen tech, financial services improve, but in the case of tourism, hotels, that's kind of coming down. And the third point about this, long-term scarring is that it's clearly far from complete. Even after, as Jahangir have said, we have like, a recovery take place in 2 years' time. For most countries, growth is going to be below pre-pandemic levels. I think there are only 2 countries, like say for instance, China achieved pre-pandemic levels last year, 2020, the US this year. But for most countries, it's still going to take a while. And therefore, I think the key thing to do is like for the government, they have kind of announced several positive good measures. The key is basically is implementation as well as execution. We have started the work, but clearly much more needs to be done.
Okay, thank you so much. We have so many questions from the floor, but KV, I know you wanted to say something in response to Jahangir. Can you make it really brief? Because we've got some very heavy-duty questions from the panel. I mean, for the panel, from the participants listening.
Amy, I actually would want to use a few minutes, maybe a couple of minutes here, because I do agree with what Jahangir and Rohini are saying. But I would want to point out, one key aspect that all of us as economists must focus on is, when there is a possible regime change, and regime change models actually, when the past trend may not be predictive of future. I think that's one thing that we have to be careful about. Only because of the kind of reforms that have been brought. Rohini talked about it. There is a change in economic thinking that that is happening here. The focus on private sector, enabling private sector, the privatization agenda, asset monetization, the focus on capital expenditure driven growth. And here I would like to highlight the difference between the policy response now vis-a-vis, for instance, following the global financial crisis. These are important changes. All I am saying is that, while for other countries it would be okay to just extrapolate from past growth, when you have significant changes happening in the economy, and mark my words, actually the impact of that will be felt from some time from now. For instance, after liberalization, the impact of that took 2 years, 2.5 years for it to show up. And many economists will miss such regime change. All I would want to highlight here is that there are seminal changes that we have brought in, and therefore just extending the past trend would not be correct in the context of India, given what I've already mentioned.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And Dr. Anpalakan, I'd like to also ask you one last quick question before we turn to questions from the floor. And that is, what in Maharashtra steps are you taking to minimize the fallout of the health crisis, the economic impact? How are you, in fact, I remember hearing that even, in the first wave, industry was given a lot of time to prepare for the lockdown, in contrast to many industries in other parts of the country. In fact, I remember talking to a very prominent industrialist. So what steps are you taking to try to reduce the economic shock of this second huge health shock of the second wave? Briefly, please. You're on mute, sir. I don't think anyone could hear you. We can't hear you.
Yes. The last year when the pandemic was there first time, then more like it was to reduce basically the impact on supply chain. It was more on a thrust on essential sectors, predominantly for like medicine, pharmaceuticals, and food related thing. Then later we come to know that you also have a continuous process. You have also other dependency on other states and also global supply chain. So state has come up with a permission portal. It was more of an automatic permission portal, which could give almost more than close to 100,000 permissions within 50 to 20 days. So in the entire period, so as far as manufacturing was concerned, if I go with the power consumption is the main indicator of what exactly the productivity. So particularly last September and October, if we compare with the last year, absolutely, except leaving Mumbai where it was close to 90%, rest of Maharashtra, the industrial power consumption was almost more than 100%. That was one thing the state could do, and also that was evident from the GST recovery also. So that is one thing. Despite pandemic, still there was a business, particularly for manufacturing, and the states have come up with host of the reforms, more like because plug and play. Now people are not ready to invest more on land and building. So the state has also thought of the innovative way of plug and play, bringing ease of business, bringing in a master permit of thing. So by the way, state could mobilize close to almost 27 billion investment last year. So this time also, when you on 13th April, when we had the break the chain guidelines, so we purposefully avoided lockdown because nowhere the lockdown was there. So particularly for a manufacturing, if you go through, the entire supply chain essential was allowed, entire export oriented units were allowed. Thirdly, all companies which are having a continuous process, because barring assembly line, now almost now everything almost close to 60% of the production assembly, they are in continuous process. They're all been allowed. Only non-essential and non-continuous are allowed. Again, with caveat was a restriction, and the principle was essential for essential is essential. So entire supply chain, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you go to suppose for example, if somebody is making a medicine, when a packaging industry, their raw materials also being taken care of. So that way, that is and even last night there was an order, final order, there was industry was totally untouched, except that hospitality and hotels are still, of course, getting it. But only one thing I want to mention: the MSMEs are really like hard pressed for liquidity. Though the government of India is doing a great effort, but still lot needs to be done. Otherwise, MSMEs to revive them, because close to more than 70% of the employment comes from MSME, even be it for manufacturing, be it services. So that is a one sector where like we need to give a serious thinking. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. We have so many questions from the floor. I don't know how to handle this. I'm thinking that maybe I should just read a few of them out, and then whoever wants to answer any one can answer them in any final remarks, because we're absolutely running out of time, which is not surprising considering that we have some of the finest minds on the Indian economy on this panel, and probably could have had, much longer session. But anyway, okay, so here we go. Everybody take notes. Here are some of the questions from the panel. This one I like a lot. What is the sustainable growth rate of India for the next decade? KV, maybe one for you. How is the government of India planning to restructure the bad debts likely to mount up from the current crisis? Unemployment and inequality are going to be the biggest challenges in the coming future. What sorts of policy interventions are needed to address them? What is the outlook for the government bond yields and the rupee? Okay, that's probably about as much as we can do. So anyone to answer any of them, with that special one for KV, although I know, as you said, you're sort of independent, but what is the government's plans for restructuring bad debts? Okay, who's first?
Let me take that, Amy. I think first question, I expect India to go back to 7% plus in a couple of years. I think next year, of course, this year actually will be an exceptional year because of the low base. But after that, and I think FY23 also the full effect of the reforms will not kick in. But after that, I think the full impact is likely to come in. So 7% plus is given the reforms and the change in economic thinking that we've brought in. On the financial sector and bad debts, I'm sure all of you have noticed the seminal measures that have been brought in: the bad bank, the infrastructure, DFIs for infrastructure, privatization of public sector banks, and this is important to understand. If you look at the overall capitalization of our banks and the provision coverage they have, unlike in the previous crisis, now provision coverage is 87% compared to in the low 20s or so earlier. So our banks are actually in a much better shape. I completely agree that there will be stress that is coming because, when the real sector will get impacted because of the first wave, the impact of that, and the second wave. But our banks are in a much better shape to handle it, and the government remains actually committed to being behind them as well. Also, one point, close to 60,000 crores capital banks have raised. That is actually, from the market, which is also indicative of the cleanup that has happened and the confidence that investors have in these banks.
Okay, thank you. Rohini.
Okay, so you mean the same questions or answer a different one?
I mean, all those questions that I threw out, answer whichever ones you'd like to answer.
Yeah, okay, so I think if we kind of focus on medium term growth, I think India's medium term growth is probably going to be maybe in the 6.5 to 6.8% range. I just want to stress that basically a lot of it is going to be dependent on the government's ability to improve the investment climate. We have seen a couple of steps being taken over the last few years. They've enacted the IBC, eased FDI, as well as lower tax rates. This is kind of reflected in basically India's ease of doing business ranking. That's kind of improved from 142 in 2014 to basically 63. Now the government's now announced a couple of very bold measures over the last 1 year. I just have to stress, like, a lot of it really depends on basically implementation. So whether it's the bad bank, asset monetization, all of that, the key focus is basically is implementation. I'll kind of link one of the other questions to this, like, what are the risks to growth, both near term and long term, and then maybe basically it can be taken over by basically Jahangir. I think what's also kind of helped most most EMs, most markets all along, is the very accommodative policies that we've seen in the Western world. Global central banks have cut interest rates. They've basically, had a lot of QE, and that's kind of basically helped flows to EMs. So we have to kind of keep in mind that what happens when things do change, and they have to kind of start removing some of this this kind of easy money that we've seen. So clearly, I would say that that's something to kind of look out for. India's position today, is a lot different from 2013. People are kind of comparing, what happened then. But clearly, that's something I would just say that there's really no room for any complacency. We have to be on guard. You will see that, when you see some sort of, accommodation being taken away, it will impact, whether it's yields or the rupee. But clearly, we are in a much stronger position as compared to 2013.
Jahangir.
So I guess it's my turn to talk about bond yields and INR.
In
I'm just
2
going to pick up
minutes.
from And I'm going to pick up from where Rohini left. I think we, underestimate the importance of global conditions. I think bond yields will be under pressure, not just because of the rise in public sector borrowing. We've already seen two auctions struggling in the last 1 month. But at the same time, there is, regardless of how low and for long the Fed keeps its front end of the curve, the short end rates, the long end rates, which have already risen about 100 basis points, are poised to rise even faster as the U.S. recovers and recovers very strongly, and there are fears of inflation moving up. So I think that the bond yields per se will be moving up. But then there is the RBI. The RBI is already, promised serious amounts of quantitative easing in terms of bond purchases. At the long end of the curve, it has a special program which they, called it 1.0, from which I'm guessing there is a 2.0 and a 3.0 and a 4.0 down the road. So, the bond yield, the 10-year bond yields will be at the mercy of how much bond purchases the RBI does. The RBI is in a bind in that it can't really possibly think of increasing liquidity even more. So whatever it provides at the long end of the curve is going to take it out of the short end of the curve. So I'm not really that concerned that bond yields are going to rise very disruptively at the long end, but at the short end, the consequence will be that the short end things are going to be much more difficult. So the curve is going to flatten. INR again depends upon what happens to the global environment, and just one factor what drives the INR. And it drives exchange rate across the world. It is the growth differential that the country has with the rest of the world. Just to give you an example, we have -4 quarter-on-quarter growth rate in India for the second quarter. This current quarter, US is probably going to grow at about 10. So, there is a massive difference between the two of them in terms of widening growth gap between the US and India, and that is naturally going to put pressures on the INR as is already done. In addition, depends on oil prices. Oil prices are most likely going to move up, and that's going to put additional pressures on the INR. But I don't really think that it's going to be disruptive. The RBI has more FX reserves than it can think about, and obviously it's going to intervene. So we are looking for intervention by the RBI, both in the bond market heavily and in the FX market heavily in the days to come. That should keep both the INR and bond yields, broadly where they are. But my sense is that the pressure will be on both to go up.
And your projection for 10-year growth, the last question, sustainable level of growth for the next decade.
Amy, I'm not brave enough to say what 10 years is going to look like. So I'm going to just give you what the next 2 years are going to look like. It is significantly lower than the 7 and the 6 that KB and Rohini talked about. Significantly less.
Okay.
So
I'm afraid. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're absolutely out of time.
No,
We're
this
out
is
of time.
important. Just on the
10 seconds.
Guys, Yes, I think markets price not only this quarter growth differentials, but long run growth differentials, and you know which country will have a much higher growth than the United States. So I don't agree with Jahangir, on this aspect. Let me make that very clear.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. I know we could go on and on. As I said, we've got some of the top economic minds that look at India on this panel, and I'm sorry that we didn't have more time, and including for the questions. But I'd like to really thank all of you for appearing here today with us, and especially also to the Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation for sponsoring us. The panel session will be available for 30 days on the website of the event if you would like to rewatch these stimulating debates. And I would like to commend to you our next session, which will be Martin Wolf, who has our chief economic commentator at the Financial Times, who has a long relationship with India dating back to his early days as a World Bank economist in the 1970s, who's going to look at his view of where India fits in the post-COVID world economy. And really all I can say is thank you so much to everyone on my panel, to all the participants who are listening, and I wish you all to continue to be safe and well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone. And
India in the post-COVID world economy. Let me start by welcoming everyone to the session, which is aptly titled and comes at a particular trying time for the nation, both in terms of the unfolding surge in COVID-19 caseloads and the fresh question marks that this raises over the projections that were made about the nascent recovery that was underway. To decipher all of this, we have with us Mr. Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, London. Martin was awarded the CBE in the year 2000 for his services to financial journalism, one of the most influential journalists of our time. Martin is an avid India watcher, who's widely read and followed in India as he is elsewhere. Before we start, I would request those who've logged in to ask questions via the Q&A box that is on the right of your screen. You can ask questions anytime through the discussion. We'll try and slip a few in towards the end of the discussion. You can also share your thoughts and your tweets on social media using the hashtag #PostPandemicIndia. So let's get down to Martin's presentation. Over to you, sir.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you. As probably everybody knows, India is one of my favorite countries, and I always loved talking about it. I would have to say before I start, in a very short presentation, that I think the title I've been given is a little optimistic. At the very least, the post-COVID world economy is not where we are now, and it is beginning to look as though we may not be there for quite a while. So that's an important part of our thinking about the future. So I'm going to talk for a relatively short period, just to set out some of the issues as I see them for India with my presentation. I'm going to cover three areas in what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm trying to set our discussion of India today and in the future in the context of its longer term performance. I think history is very important. Then I'll talk very briefly about the COVID-19 impact, focusing on the economics. And then I'll talk again very briefly on the challenges ahead, many of which are familiar. But the big story is, I think, that it's pretty clear that India has been slowing. The Indian economy has been slowing. My own guess is that trend growth now is somewhere in the 5 to 6% range. Nobody really knows. And India will need, in what's likely to be a difficult world environment, quite a bit of policy change and reform if it's going to be successful, and particularly successful as everybody wants it to be, in the decade or so ahead. So let me start by looking at long-term performance, which I think is very, very interesting. So this chart, it's a little complicated and I won't go through it all, but it shows for quite a number of very significant emerging and developing countries, GDP per head measured at purchasing power parity, so that's real terms, relative to the US, which is the world's most productive large economy. And you can see it starts at the top with Russia, Turkey, and Mexico. Turkey and Russia both did pretty well. Turkey particularly so, by the way, until relatively recently. And this is forecast up to 2025 because these are IMF forecasts. Mexico's down terribly. Brazil is down terribly. That's the yellow one. And then you get to a group of Asian countries with which you might naturally want to compare India. The red line, fourth from the bottom, the left, is Indonesia. Then you have China in black. I put in Pakistan and Bangladesh simply to compare your country, India, with the immediate neighbors. And China is, of course, a simply incredible story. It went from 5% of US levels to a forecast of 35% by 2025. That's the most spectacular story in human history. India is the blue with dots, and it's also done pretty well. It's gone from 5% to close to 15%. So this is a big relative rise, but obviously nothing comparable to China's. So one would say this is convergence, but not immensely dramatic, and it's still a relatively poor country with lots of potential for catch-up. This chart shows the growth rates of GDP, and they're 5-year moving averages, and they're centered. So the figure for, say, 2004 includes 2002, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and it showed for 2004. Again, red is China, the purple is India, the green is Bangladesh, and the black is Indonesia. And you can see that India had a good, steady growth, running about 6% a year for a long time, peaking at about very close to 9% in the early 2000s. And since then, slowing slowly, not slowing dramatically like China, being about 7% or so. These GDP data are, of course, a little bit controversial, as many of you know. Then there's been a real collapse because last year was so terrible. But it is clearly slowing. And that slowing down has gone on now for quite a long time. In the early 2000s, people thought India might hit 10%, and it's pretty clear that it's now closer to 6%. Now, in looking at the growth and the slowdown, there are a couple of pretty important proximate reasons for the slowdown. The first, the big surge in growth was correlated with an enormous surge in credit. Credit to GDP ratio exploded in India, as it did in many other countries. There wasn't a financial crisis in India, but as tends inevitably the case, it slowed. It peaked, it's gone up again recently, but really since the end of the first decade in this period, in this century, credit growth has slowed dramatically. There are big problems in the credit system, in the banking sector, with lots of bad loans, mostly generated in that earlier period. And the credit dynamo, the credit growth engine, is clearly exhausted. It's not going to do again what it did in the early 2000s. And the other dramatic change, and it really is dramatic, is trade ratios. So these are exports of goods and services and imports of goods and services. There's a change in data, as there were in so many other things in India in the middle of the last decade. But basically, these exploded upwards after the liberalization of 1990. They were a very dramatic source, a powerful source of growth. They peaked in about 2013, 14, and have now been falling rapidly. India is deglobalizing, not back to where it was before, but it's very, very clear India is deglobalizing, and it's deglobalizing more than the world is, as a matter of fact. And that's due to policy choices, basically increased protection, in my view, decreased attention to export competitiveness. And that's another growth engine which has sort of been turning off. And the final growth engine, of course, might be fiscal policy, fiscal deficits. But we can see now these are debt ratios, these are gross public debt or gross general government debt. There has been a huge rise, probably quite sensible, in response to the COVID crisis. These are IMF forecasts. So about 20 percentage point rise in India's public debt ratio to about 90%. That's pretty high. Well, actually, it's very high for an emerging country. And it's not easy to see that huge deficits can be run much longer. And that's what the IMF assumes, but that means that fiscal policy from now on is likely to be somewhat contractionary. So credit, trade, fiscal policy are all going to be constraints. So that's the long run performance, where we are a slowing economy with some very important engines weakening. Then there was the COVID-19 crisis. And this is what happened to growth of a number of very important economies in 2020. Bangladesh did astonishingly well. I still don't fully understand that, but China and Turkey continued to grow. India had, among developing countries, a really, really bad negative hit, sort of with Mexico and Argentina. South American countries did particularly badly. And of course, some of the advanced countries, the high-income countries in Europe, like the UK, Italy, France, also did very, very badly. But this is a very big shock, particularly given that India normally grows at 5 or 6%. So in terms of the shift from normal growth, this is pretty dramatic. And but it has one advantage, according to the IMF, which is that the output gap in India is now very, very large. At the end of at this time now, the output gap, according to them, is about 6% of GDP. This is much higher than they expected to be. So there's an immense short-term recovery potential. And it's very, very important that that short-term recovery happens. The difficulty, of course, is that with COVID cases increasing, as I see it, very rapidly, that might not happen. It might be postponed, and it might therefore have substantial scarring, particularly on investment in the Indian economy. There's a potential for growth, but short-term growth, but we don't know whether this will be realized. And then finally, let me touch briefly on the obvious challenges ahead. The first and most obvious is to get control of COVID itself. And the best vehicle for doing so, as we can already see this very clearly in countries that have been successful, is mass vaccination. And this shows for the G20 countries, of which, of course, India is one, the vaccination rates. This was as of last week. No, this was as of 4 days ago, 4 or 5 days ago, because it appeared in a column of mine this week. And we can see there's a massive divergence. India is not at the bottom, but the vaccination rate, according to this, is a little under 10%. I think it's about 8% of the population, and that's just one dose. So the challenge of vaccinating the enormous Indian population effectively and giving them 2 doses in most cases is absolutely gigantic. And that will, of course, make it very, very difficult to get fully beyond the COVID crisis. And if we look at the future, it's pretty clear that the globalization engine has run out. So it's not just India's deglobalizing, to some degree the world is. So this is a chart I produced a little while ago, showed 3-year moving average growth for world GDP and trade. And you can see up to the crisis, world trade was growing much faster than the world GDP. And since then, it's basically growing at the same rate. And we expect there to be decoupling and slowing growth, particularly because of the breakdown of relations between the US and China. And that's going to create some problems, but it might create opportunities. If China is not exporting so much to the West, well, why shouldn't India do so? So there is an opportunity to be seized here. Policymakers are imaginative. And then finally, so what does this mean in terms of policy? My view is that India has to reopen its economy, take all the trading opportunities it can, become a hub for new trade growth, particularly now relations between China and the West are deteriorating. To do that, it needs to raise international competitiveness, and that requires raising investment and productivity growth. That can't be done without reforming the financial sector and making the public sector also much more efficient. That's been a big problem. And in the longer term, it's going to need to be more successful in education, liberalizing the labor markets, which the government is certainly trying to do, and of course, starting its green revolution, along with the rest of the world, combining growth with reliance on renewables. So there are immense policy challenges, but I do remain of the view that India can and should be the fastest growing economy, major economy in the world over the next 20 years. It can and should grow at 8% plus. It can be done, but it won't happen without quite a lot of change. I said I'd talk for about 12, 13 minutes, and I think I've done so. I know it's been very quick, but that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for the really insightful analysis, as always. You've talked about the trend growth now staying at around 5 to 6% per annum. And the 2 engines that you really see sort of constraining the growth factors are the credit engine and the trade engine, which were there 10 years ago. But even before India entered the pandemic, we'd seen 8 successive quarters of declining growth. The whole leverage issue, the debt overhang, both on bank books and on corporate balance sheets, continues to fester. It's still there. And the way the second wave has hit us, it seems that private consumption story, which had held up for the last 5-7 years, that also sort of petering out. There is a concern. Much of the heavy lifting that has been done by public investments, and that also could be constrained given that the debt to GDP ratio, as you said, is about 90% and 20 percentage points over what is generally the comfort level, and the fact that it could stay over 80% till 2026. So do you see that the government investment, the only engine that was firing, also shutting down? And is your 5 to 6% also perhaps a tad over optimistic?
Well, I always like to be a little optimistic in dealing with this. 5 to 6%, well, perhaps I would qualify. I think 5% to 5% is perfectly doable without immense reform. But I agree with you, and that's why I stressed it at the end. if they don't finally really fix the financial sector big time, even that won't happen. As I was said, as things are, the trade engine, the credit engine, and the government spending engine all look pretty weak, right? The government spending engine won't help much. It has to be much more efficient and shifted spending to do that. The trade engine will take time. So a lot of the bad debt has to be eliminated. The problem, of course, in eliminating the bad debt, my assumption is quite a bit of it will end on the public sector balance sheet. That's what usually happens when you deal with so that will further constrain the government. I think the Indian government's credit position is, I've argued this periodically in the past. I have even sent a submission to the N.K. Singh Commission on fiscal policy that India can borrow, it can sustain itself if it gets back to growth. But of course, that further constrains the public sector. So they've got to clean up the financial sector, and that also means changes in corporate governance at the same time. If those things are done, the financial sector above all, and links with the corporate sector, I think you can get to 5-6% growth. Okay. If nothing is done, it is possible. I hate to even to think about it. We're going back to what my friend Raj Krishna called the Hindu rate of growth, which is 3-4%. That will be a catastrophe because that's per capita growth of 2%. And the catch-up story that I showed in my first chart would end. It would end while India is still a relatively poor country. I just cannot believe that the Indian government will let that happen.
The Indian Prime Minister is seen as a decisive leader. He's got a lot of political capital, and he came riding this Gujarat economic success story. That's what brought him to Delhi. And the Gujarat model primarily was a private enterprise and investment story. But the one thing that is visible from 2014 onwards very clearly is the lack of the ability of the government to crowd in private investments, to catalyze private investment. What do you think has gone wrong, and is the Prime Minister ill-advised? Do you think that he spent too much effort on other things like the temple or the Kashmir issue? Is there a problem there in terms of focusing on the economy? What do you think?
Well, it has to be said that this government is a really big puzzle for outside observers. And I've even met the Prime Minister, and I really don't understand what's going on. I mean, let me make an economic point and a political point. I can make the political point, can't I? The economic point is the conditions in which the Gujarat miracle occurred were the conditions in which there was very strong growth in the Indian economy as a whole and very strong credit growth. So the private sector growth miracle you saw in Gujarat was a particularly important part of an Indian story. It wasn't just Gujarat. But we know that by 2010 or so, certainly by 2012, that was over. That was nothing to do with this government. It was over before. There had been a lot of pretty sloppy lending, and the financial sector was seriously overstretched, and there had been a lot of bad projects. So the private sector growth story had to be reignited. And most economists who looked at this closely in 2014, 15, all realized that. So to reignite it, there had to be radical financial restructuring. And that included, of course, letting a lot of companies go through the bankruptcy process and reemerge properly capitalized. And that included the banks. And the banks were mostly pretty badly run, so a lot of them had to be privatized. This nettle was perfectly clear to everybody, Raghuram Rajan and his successors and the economic advisors, but the government never really grasped it, not adequately. Why? Don't know. They went off to do monetary reform, demonetization, which, like most people, I thought was crazy. Now, so they never grasped that. They reversed policy on the great success of trade liberalization. It's clear that they have on that. They've become more inward-looking and more protectionist. Maybe that's the instinct of many of them, that they should be more nationalist. And of course, the post-crisis deglobalization encouraged that. So that went. So the credit engine went, and the trade growth thing went, and the public sector's fiscal capacity has been used up. Okay, so you need, and in this period, one would have to say that the government's policy on economic reform has therefore been inconsistent, not sufficiently positive. They've often the quite good rhetoric, but really very clearly not the dominant focus of the government. Very, very clearly. And then, of course, when the economy is not going so well, and anyway, it's part of your ideology, domestic political issues come to the fore. I think that's what happened. But it seems to me that at some stage, Mr. Modi, who's clearly an intelligent human man and a remarkable politician, will say, I'm not going to be able to succeed if I don't get the Indian economy to perform well. That's a necessary condition for success. Must be. It must be. So they must return to a basic reform agenda, reverse the mistakes, and build on the reforms and introduce these obvious reforms. Will any of that happen? I don't know. But if they don't happen, I really do think that, my 5-6% is on the assumption that basic reforms happen. Some things happen, particularly on the financial sector. If none of this happens, then I think they could be 3-4%, and then the politics seems to be to get very, very ugly.
Quickly, if I can slip in a question, because running out of time, do you see some hope with the budget, the latest budget that was presented in terms of the reform intent?
Yes, I think people I trust who've looked at it more closely than I have only looked at would say they mentioned privatization. That's a very good thing. They seem to be aware of some of the issues, again, particularly in finance. The question is, what will it really amount to, and how deeply committed is the government as a whole to it? This is not going to be done by the finance ministry on its own. Ultimately, this will clearly be driven, if it's by anybody, by the Prime Minister, and he has to realize that if this economic performance is not turned around, and what happened in COVID-19 economically is a disaster, clearly, for India to, it's lost 12 percentage points of GDP growth, at least, if you compare with what it should have been. If that isn't reversed, then he has a tremendous problem.
Thank you. I think we'd have to wrap it up. Thank you, Martin, for the really insightful perspectives, and all of you who've logged in for the session. The session will be available on demand for a minimum of 30 days on the event website. We now move on to the next session, India's business growth. It is moderated by my colleague P. Vaidyanathan Iyer. Thank you.
तुम कारीगर हो या जादूगर हो, क्या क्या रचना रचते हो। मोम बनाते पीतल को, शोलों को शीशा करते हो, ढाल के उसमें इंद्रधनुष तुम कोरी कलाई पे सजते हो। तुम कारीगर हो या जादूगर हो, सदियों से इस हुनर को तुमने ऐसे सहेज के रखा है जैसे मोती सीप के तन में युगों युगों तक रहता है। तुम कारीगर हो या जादूगर हो। 75 wonders of Uttar Pradesh, own one. Imagine a poet's fantasy coming alive on shimmering black clay, like the sun's ray, dancing, kissing on your beloved's face, taking your breath away. Such is the black magic of Azamgarh. It's not merely pottery, it's poetry. Own one. 75 Wonders of Uttar Pradesh. Own one.
Hi, welcome to everybody for this, continuation of the Financial Times Indian Express online series on India in the post-pandemic world. I have with me a very stellar panel, and uh, uh, and we have Shobna Kamineni, who's the executive vice chairperson for Apollo Hospitals. Uh, Probably the best we could have had today, given the circumstances that we are living in. Uh, we have Manish Sabarbal, who's founder and chairman of Team Lease, Mr. Naushad Forbes, who's the co-chairman, Forbes Marshall, and also to join us shortly would be Siddharth Nath Singh, cabinet minister in Uttar Pradesh for the medium and small industries, investment and exports, textiles. Welcome all. Uh, if I can just start uh, Naushad, let me pick on you first. Uh, One of the most interesting things in India that has happened over the last couple of years has been uh, one that we have seen tariffs across several sectors, and simultaneously over the last 12 to 14 months we have also seen that India has, the Prime Minister and the government has pushed through a ambitious Atmanirbhar or a self-reliant India program. Uh, do you think that, given the pace of reforms, given the way India has moved over the last 30 years, these tariffs that have been imposed of late, does it hurt the industry in terms of export competitiveness? Does it kind of go with the larger principle of reforms that India has seen?
So, Vaidi, as you know, I've written some about this as well, and I believe the increasing protection that we've seen over the last 4 years is a step in reverse for us as a country. It ends up protecting Indian industry, which means we end up actually being less competitive. Having said that, during the pandemic, the production-linked incentive scheme that's been announced by the government is intended to deepen supply chains. It goes, unfortunately, together with protection, but I hope that that protection can be temporary. I think actually, if we want the protection, if we want the production-linked incentive scheme to deliver competitiveness, it needs to be combined with two more things. It needs to be combined with a sell-by date. It needs to be combined with a date at which point the tariffs go away, the protection goes away. So within a maximum period of 5 years, when the tariffs must all go away. And it needs to be combined with a requirement that the firms that invest in those particular products export them. Because if they export them, that will automatically be a disciplining process, a process that will force competitiveness on the firm itself. It will force adequate scale on the firm itself. And then I think as a result of this production-linked incentive scheme, we could end up in a better place at the end of the next 2, 3, 4 years. So it has the potential to go in the right direction. But I worry that if we rely largely on protection to enhance local manufacturing, we will end up, as we were in the 70s, with an industrial structure that is less competitive, that is less integrated with the world, and where we as industry and as an economy benefit less from the world economy and the growth opportunities it provides.
Yeah. Manish, let me draw you in on this. This is basically when we are looking at India Inc. As part of the global supply chains and integrating with the rest of the world. Do you think that that needs to be an end by date, that there's an expiry, that should be an expiry time for such protective measures? Or is it time that, say, Indian industry, manufacturing sector, several sectors actually need that space to breathe, need that space to kind of become bigger and then be able to compete with the rest of the world?
I mean, I don't think it's the role of the government to set things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. But I do think we have to acknowledge India isn't where China was in 1978. Deng Xiaoping was very skilled, but he was also very lucky. He got a 30-year super cycle of global growth, a 30-year super cycle of openness to trade, and a 30-year deconstruction of manufacturing supply chains. I think manufacturing has changed. It's much labor intensive than it used to be, because I think global growth is muted, and I think that openness to trade is under question everywhere. So I think that it is obviously, if you look at it from the lens of the license Raj, there are challenges with rising tariffs, but it's a tariff neutral. I mean, you're giving whatever extra tariffs, in fact, much more is being given out as the PLI. So this is not really a financial sort of scheme. It's really going to be a net minus anyway. So I think that, as Naushad says, animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle. So let's not sort of create a who can only survive with the PLI or the tariffs. But I'm not sure, as I study history, that antibiotic reaction to any sort of tariffs or any PLIs, any country has done that. And so after 1991, we were also upset with sort of the license Raj remnants, that we sort of had an antibiotic reaction to any tariffs or any incentives. And, P.G. Woodhouse used to say, a cat who sat on a hot stove will never sit on a cold stove again. But I think that the last few years has sort of taught us that maybe there is a little more to building capabilities than sort of just letting everybody free. But as I agree, all of us, and even the policymakers, are sort of bittersweet on this, right? It's not like this is a slam dunk. But I think we need a more adventurous state. Let's take some risks. And this is a risk which we acknowledge may go wrong but could go right also.
Yeah. Shobna, if I may, given that we are in the midst of a second wave and the COVID-19 dashboard looks quite ominous, with 3 lakh plus cases today and 2,100 deaths in a day, how do you think this localized lockdowns have affected, one, of course, the industry, but more specifically the healthcare sector? How has it been able to cope with the shortages in cylinders, in ICU beds, or even in drugs? Suddenly we seem to be in a scarcity economy in healthcare infrastructure. Do you really think that we haven't really invested enough over the years in healthcare, and suddenly we are in the midst, even though we ramped up over the last 1 year, we are in the midst of a crisis again? What is the sense that you get?
First, Vaidi, I want to apologize to everyone that has not been able to get a bed, that is struggling without oxygen, or that is struggling without medicine. That itself will tell you that we've all collectively done something wrong. So I feel terrible. But having said that, cold reality and truth is we're not so bad. And a couple of things, I love what Manish and Naushad has said. But tell me, guys, we used to buy gloves. Malaysia is the single biggest producer of gloves in the world. We used to buy them for 1 rupee. Today we're buying them at 8 rupees. So tell me, we do need some Atmanirbhar. There's some industries that need. And now it's super scary because oxygen cylinders have not been allowed to cross the border, because they're saying, made in our state, we want it more. Or it can happen to vaccines. So tell me, then Atmanirbhar breaks down into states. So right now, let us not judge anything in this crisis. So we need to step back, think about reality. We're all in a war. So whatever happens now, we all have to be collective and say that let's fight. Let's make sure that we get anything at any price to make sure that we're saving lives. So if a lockdown is necessary, some amount is required for the discipline, because people stopped believing. They really thought, many of them thought, okay, I'm vaccinated, I'll never get this thing and infected. And others thought that it's all gone away, that we've done such a good job with vaccination, largest in the world, that there's no more COVID. And people stopped masking, people stopped behaviors. So I think let's get our mindset back to saying that nothing is going to change. We are in a COVID war. We're in a COVID world. India will take a long time now with this setback to recover, and we need to do whatever we can to start saving lives. It was the last one to say this early, but I think right now, as this wave progresses, we're all in this together. Every death is on each one of us that have not followed or not been able to provide more for people.
Yeah. But in terms of industry, has it really risen to the occasion? Say even in the first wave, we saw that people were lining up in hospitals, getting difficult, facing huge difficulties. Has that ramp up happened? Do you get that sense, or we let the guard off at some point of time?
We bought 100 oxygen concentrators in a week. This is India. We have ventilators. So we're just ramping up. It's just that we let our guard down. The people let their guard down. It's PPEs are available. Now that they stopped export of remdesivir, there's going to be enough of it in the country. India has world-class manufacturing capability for vaccines and for pharmaceuticals. So I think from that aspect, we're better off in healthcare. This kind of crisis in any other country would have been truly of unprecedented humanitarian proportions. So I would give credit to Indian industry for our resourcefulness and for the fact that we put our heart before our head at the beginning, and I think that everyone will step forward again.
Yeah. Manish, on last say 12, 14 months, we have also seen that the government really kind of pushed through certain difficult reforms which were kind of we couldn't really imagine in this budget itself. Besides of course the farm laws as part of the series of Atmanirbhar press conferences which the finance minister had. There were several other reforms on say MSME, allowing them to scale up, the labor code, and of course we actually mentioned the privatization word in the budget after a very, very long period, or probably the first time we had strategic investment, not really privatization. So how do you look at these as, do you look at these as individual kind of reforms targeted at specific industries, or do you see a collective message on that?
I mean, I think that, COVID is a human tragedy, but obviously political philosopher John Kingdon talked about a policy window, when the problem, solution, and the opportunity come together. And I think we have seized that policy window. 1991 was very important for India, but it was incomplete. We didn't tackle formalization, we didn't tackle financialization of farming, the new education policy, the labor codes, and much else. Now the announcing of privatizing banks, the competitor to NPCI, the licensing of new banks. So I think the financialization, urbanization, formalization, skilling, and sort of industrialization has been given is really connected. India doesn't have a jobs problem, we have a wages problem. We've talked about this for a long time, right? That India's unemployment rate has been between 4 and 9% since independence. But obviously our poverty has been 30. So I would submit that, yes, we have had a good policy COVID in a certain sense. A crisis like this doesn't increase support for reform, it reduces resistance to reform. And that's really what has been used to sort of, so I think we will come out on the other side stronger. Obviously, it's not climate change, it's a passing shower. It's a downpour, of course. But I think when people sort of think of COVID and say, well, what will happen post-COVID? I think India is one of the only countries with more than 200 million people with 20 years of growth ahead of us. And that's showing up in FDI confidence. So I think, yes, I think that the policy window has been well utilized. There are 3-4 things left. There's civil service reform, urban reform, and a little more in education. But I think on the whole, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 18 months.
So would you agree, Naushad, in the sense the ambitious reforms that the government pushed through during this last 14 months, they kind of provide an enabling environment for Indian industry to really scale up and go global, so to say?
I do think so. I think that there have been some very valuable and useful reforms undertaken in this last period. I have 3 concerns. The three concerns are: one, on the actual implementation of the reforms that have been announced, in particular the privatization program that's been announced. I'd like to see much more granular detail coming out from the finance ministry of exactly how the privatization program will be driven and how we will deliver on our disinvestment goals, given that in the last 3 years we have not met what we budgeted for disinvestment. So what are we actually changing on the ground such that we will deliver? I think there is more grounds for hope this time round, given how we've gone about the process, but I'd like to see more detail flowing through. Second is the point that you mentioned on protection earlier on. I think as long as we remain a protectionist economy, as long as we rely on tariffs as a way of fostering domestic production, I think we're going to harm our longer term growth prospects. So I do have that concern as well. And third, you know, while we can look at implementation of all the reforms, there are two landmark reforms that took place: the agricultural reform and the labor reforms. These took place in September. Long overdue, very, very welcome. Agriculture, as you know, is a state subject under the Indian Constitution. Unless the states are on board, they will not get those reforms will not start showing good positive results. It can show results only if the states really are engaged with them and implement them in an effective way. Labor, as you know, is a concurrent subject. It requires movement by both the union and the states. And again, unless the states are on board with that particular reform, we will not see the kind of utility coming through from the reforms themselves. That's my third concern. How can the union government reach out to the states to make our federal system more effective, to make our states line up more effectively? And given that there are BJP governments in 2/3 of our states today in the country, so there should be alignment, but I'm not sure. At least I'm not hearing, of even how various BJP states are effectively taking on board and implementing the agricultural reforms, effectively taking on board and implementing the labor reforms. And I think if we see some of that happening, then I think the potential to really deliver on the reforms undertaken in this last year will be quite substantial.
Yeah. Let me bring in, Mr. Siddharth Singh, the chief minister, a cabinet minister in one of the largest, BJP ruled states in the country, Uttar Pradesh. He's also the cabinet minister for, of course, medium and small industries, as well as textiles, investments. Mr. Singh, how do you look at this? Like in terms of, say, the large reforms that the union government kind of announced over the last 12-14 months in the MSME segment or in farm laws or the labor code, has the UP government kind of brought in board all of these reforms? How have they impacted your state?
Well, to begin with, the labor reforms, since it relates to this as a state, it's definitely a concurrent list. But it was introduced after the COVID, during the COVID-1 phase by Uttar Pradesh, and then it was subsequently picked up by Gujarat. It was picked up by Madhya Pradesh, and many other states they picked up subsequently, which are the BJP ruled states. So, and similarly has been done on the agriculture side. Whatever the government of India has introduced the agricultural reforms, but 3 of them they introduced. All 3 have been accepted by all the state governments which belong to BJP. So I don't know why Mr. Forbes is saying that he hasn't heard, but they all 3 have been on board the BJP ruled states, and certainly the state agriculture is a state subject. So anything which is passed by the central government, it has to be adopted as an ordinance or through a legislation in the state. So we have already done that. And as I can say on the UP front, we are already working under those new law, I would say, no more a reform, I would say. They are the new law under which the UP agriculture system is working. And so I don't see that to be a problem. And certainly it is benefiting the state also. And to give few examples, I can say, because I'm an investment minister, due to these kind of reforms in last 1 year, big players like PepsiCo and all these, they came up to UP. They have invested almost about 900 crores in Mathura, and they are making those chips factories, and we got them through FPOs. FPOs is again a big reform in the agriculture sector. So FPOs have come together, and 11,000 farmers are producing potatoes under new contract and new technology, new seeds, and certainly they will be benefited. So 3 lakh metric tons of potatoes is being manufactured or produced by 11,000 farmers. So similarly, I can give you more, like in the mint growing areas in Sitapur, there are others in the rice growing area. So these kind of reforms have certainly benefited UP, and we are well, actually reaping the fruits of it.
Yep, yeah. Shobna, coming back to the healthcare and say the need for vaccines, which is the lifeline and kind of probably will help break the COVID chain. Now that the government has opened up 50% of sales to private players, how do you look at this? Is there a flip side to it, with some states kind of suggesting that it increases prices for them, and also at the end of the day the consumer who will go to a private hospital will pay a much higher price? The government did say that 45 plus they would continue with the nationwide vaccination program, but what happens below 45? What is it that you think about this opening up?
I actually like it, because even from the beginning, I felt that many people would come to us and said, "What? Only 250 rupees? Why don't you charge more?" And we represented to the government saying that, why are you taking the cost for people that can actually pay? So in effect, the government, by doing this two-pronged strategy of still saying that we'll support the above 45, those with comorbidities, and then the people over 60, and we'll still give it to them at that price with the Aadhaar card. I think that they're really doing a good thing. Also, the government vaccine that we have given, to the less privileged, will be at that price. So I don't, I think this is a way that to incentivize. And actually, because I know that all the vaccine guys were really screaming, and they said, we're getting $12 if we export it. Why do we have to keep it in India? Now here's an economic reason why it should come to us first. And I love the fact that it's opened up to 18 million. I mean, 18 plus. My only worry is that will we get enough? That's the thing. Now that they've opened up and we've started speaking to them, we don't want to be in competition with the government and the state government saying that anything you supply is only for me, or Maharashtra says vaccine is made here, or Telangana says it's made here, we get it first. We should not have all this. So as a central coordinating policy, the center should come and say, now they've said 50-50, but we should really make that happen. So net, it's a good thing.
So, Mr. Siddharthnath Singh, as a state government, do you think that this interstate distribution of vaccines between states, among states, and between, say, the states and the private hospitals, that should be better left for the central government to handle? Or do you think that this could lead to kind of huge, say, fracas in just procurement by states and private hospitals?
Well, I think
what has
initial
UP government thought
stages.
about?
Well, initial stages, I would say centralized system is workable, because there are many issues related to it, be it the production side, the cold chain side, then subsequently, how do you administer it? What is the reaction? A lot of things goes through it. So the government did it, and it's the right time that it has been opened up. I don't see why the other states are crying about it. It's a welcome step. The Prime Minister has taken that step. And those who are promoting or the idea that it should be, what happens to those people who are poor people, then Shobna is in trouble, because then the rates will start applying of the district hospitals into
No.
the Apollo also. So
Oh,
that kind of concept is absolutely
thought of-
bizarre. It's
I
a
was for
bizarre
the-
idea that they have given. So it's a bizarre idea. Certainly that doesn't apply. We need to allow those in the competitive market, that the competition is there, and that competition is left with the private players, not with the government hospital. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, we took a call that the state government will still, those who come above the 18 years, the state government will fund it and we will vaccinate. But we know that many of them, those will not like to go to the district hospitals or the the PHCs and all. They would rather prefer a private hospital. So those who can pay are allowed to go there. But there is a capping also for the private people, and which is not too heavy a load that anybody cannot afford. And you need more doctors, you need more vaccination centers to vaccinate the entire country. The government facilities are also limited. How do you introduce with the private people to play that role? They have their own expenses to run. So I don't think that's more of a politics, those who are playing it, rather than being, looking at the national interest, I would say.
That's exactly
Would you
what
like to
I'm
make a
saying.
brief comment, Shobna, on this? Yeah.
I completely agree with Mr. Singh that that's exactly what we've been advocating right from the beginning. That those that need it most, that the government is there for them, and that's the role of health for all. And those that can pay for it, we'll do it at a capped price. Right from, we were the ones that have done the most number of private vaccinations at 250 rupees. We didn't take a paisa more, and we believe this is in national interest. We need to get the country back on its feet. So completely aligned.
Yeah. Manish, one of the biggest things during, this crisis, and even before the crisis, has been jobs. The issue of jobless growth over the last couple of years. You have very interesting views on this. But looking at, say, what happened with the migrant crisis, labor returning back home, and many getting, uh, even in cities, in urban places where they were without jobs and stuck. Do you think in the long run there is an issue about uh, jobs being created unless you are creating large factories? What is your sense?
I mean, I think that development is 5 labor market transitions: farm to non-farm, rural to urban, subsistence self-employment to decent wage employment, informal to formal, and school to work. But I think you can't take jobs to people, you have to take people to jobs in the short run. But the challenge we have had is India only has 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China has 375. So we define urbanization as shoving more people into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Hyderabad. So I think the target India should set itself is 200 cities with more than 1 million people. And obviously, on a national scale, it may be a generalization, but people from the east and the north have been migrating to the south and the west. Though not obviously on the scale of China. China in Chinese New Year, they have 250 million people buy a train ticket to go home on a 4-day weekend. Now, we don't have that on Chhat, Diwali, Eid, or Christmas. So we probably have 75 million migrants, of which 30 million are interstate migrants, of which 30 million are dependents and 40 million are. But I would say that I think that post-COVID, many people believe that cities don't matter, offices don't matter. I don't think that's correct. New York's GDP is equal to Russia for a reason. There are benefits to coming together. So I think the net impact of COVID should be accelerating these 5 transitions: farm to non-farm, rural to urban, informal to formal. But obviously we'll have to think about states like like, why are people coming down south? My parents retired to live in Kanpur, which is in UP, and I live in Karnataka. Karnataka and UP have the same with 1/4 the number of people. So the productivity here is 4 times higher. And so I think the whole of the nation has to come together to raise our productivity in land, labor, capital. And more importantly, in the fourth element of what economists actually don't understand, which is entrepreneurship and innovation and doing business. So making the north and west, making the north of India and east of India as fertile a habitat for job creation as the south and west have been in the last 20 years is really important for India to sort of put poverty in the museum that it belongs. And this kind of level of migration, when the migrants are sort of going back home during COVID, we have to really ask ourselves on how we're going to be able to take jobs to people rather than people to jobs, though in the short run that may not be possible.
Yeah. So, Mr. Singh, there is something solid which Manish has led me on to ask you. UP saw one of the biggest migrant influxes, post in the first wave. August, September, we saw that almost 3 million to 4 million people came to UP, came back to their homes in Uttar Pradesh. Why is it that Uttar Pradesh has lagged, say, behind Karnataka or say a Tamil Nadu in terms of setting up large industries or to provide employment to its own people who do not kind of move around?
Well, let me put. I can't really answer for what happened beyond 2000 or beyond 2017 when the other governments were there. Perhaps the only industry that was existing in Uttar Pradesh was the government. So everybody wanted to make money out of the government. So there was nothing else left in. So. And it's obvious reason that if you have some work, people have to leave their land and then go to somewhere else. That's a natural process which was happening, and it is unfortunate that it was happening. But you need to reverse. And let me put this. Well, what Manish has said, I still feel that the economy needs to be reversed. It can't be just urban, urban, urban. We need to create more cities, certainly. We need to urbanize more of the rural area, certainly. But at the same time, a place like Uttar Pradesh, I just take that as an example to speak. We are agro-based economy, so 65 to 70% of the population does stay in the rural area. Now, if I or the government doesn't create employment there, then people will migrate. Either they will come to Kanpur or Lucknow or Varanasi, or they will leave this place or go to Karnataka or anywhere else. Now, to do that, you need to create jobs and facilitate jobs. And certainly, let me put this. One of our reform schemes has been one district, one product. Now, what we did was under ODOP, we picked up in all 75 districts products which were traditional products, perhaps even 500,000 years back, and the craftsmen and the farmers or many others were, engaged in that kind of a business, and we started helping them with technology. We started hand-holding them with getting them a better common facility centers. We created many common facility centers. We introduced the best of the raw material bank for them. We arranged financing from them from various sources. Then certainly we got into the packaging industry with them. We introduced a branding from them. So a lot of things we got it done. And we realized from 2017 and when I was in 2020, the exports of Uttar Pradesh through these items jumped 38%. Now, that helps to create an economy in that particular district. To give further example, and then I will move on, a place like Siddharth Nagar, which is next to Gorakhpur, perhaps you all may have not heard about it. The traditional item has been there called Kala Namak Chawal. Now that chawal, if we go to a Chinese or a Japanese restaurant on a 5-star or outside India, that is called sticky rice. Now that sticky rice, through various, business councils and all, we arranged people during the COVID to come from Japan and Singapore. Not all came down because Japan still didn't open, but still we managed to send the samples, and many people through other routes, they came to India. We took them to Siddharth Nagar. Because of the reform which farm reforms that Naushad was talking, it helped us to do a contract farming. Today, that rice is fetching them 600 rupees per kilo. In the local market, it is sold for 70, 80 rupees. So that helps to generate the rural economy. With the boost in rural economy, today Uttar Pradesh is seeing more of Royal Enfield being sold in rural area than the urban area. So things can be reversed. Unless until we don't have a model, it will be always be difficult. Once you develop that, you provide them the electricity, you provide them a job, not provide in the sense, you facilitate a job, an economy in the rural areas. I'm quite confident that with schooling and hospitals, things will improve, and the urbanization will also happen, and that load, the urban load, will be reduced, and that infrastructure will not crumble. So we need to adopt this model, and I think it is helping Uttar Pradesh to move their state GDP. In last 4 years, that's been one of the policies, major policy thrust. And today, I'm happy to say, as a state GDP, we rank after Maharashtra and not after many of the states being mentioned from down south.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. But I really would love to see, big names coming into Uttar Pradesh. Over the last, say 5, 6 years, I haven't really heard many industries, big names.
Well, let me
MNC.
enlighten
Yep.
you. No, Mr.
Yeah.
Vednathan, let me enlighten you. The
Yeah.
the Microsoft campus has come in Uttar Pradesh. TCS is in Uttar Pradesh. Infosys has come to Uttar Pradesh. Wipro is there. Then moving on from there, for defense industry, the defense corridor is there. Many of the items which are to be manufactured in the new Tejas and other things are being manufactured now in Uttar Pradesh. The barrels and many of the engines for the 155 howitzers will be manufactured in Uttar Pradesh. There are one of the biggest French company, I would say, which is in telecom, in cyber security and defense, called Thales, which is a largely supplier of the railways. So that is also come to Uttar Pradesh. So there are many things which are coming to Uttar Pradesh. So I will ensure that Indian Express and Financial Times starts reporting us better.
Absolutely, we'll do that. Mr. Forbes, one of the things that which has kind of which leaves many questions is private investments over the last few years has remained sluggish, and over the last 12-14 months, of course, the government has introduced many reform measures. What more do you think is required for private sector to start investing more aggressively in the economy today?
Well, investment is in fresh capacity is a reflection of two things. First and foremost, it's a reflection of demand. Are you reaching the limits of capacity? And if you're reaching the limits of capacity, then you invest in more. The second thing that it reflects is animal spirits. If animal spirits are buoyant, if you're very confident about the future, then when you hit, say, 70, 75% capacity utilization, you start investing. If you're sort of depressed and worried about the future and there's lots of uncertainty, then you wait until you hit 85, 90% of capacity before you start investing. But that really, so investment is really a reflection of that combination of using up your capacity and enough confidence that exists across industry such that you start creating capacity earlier than when logically you would need to actually create it. Now, what can the government do? The government cannot really stimulate demand. And I think sometimes we have misplaced expectations of what the government can do to stimulate demand. It can do one thing, though, and one big thing to stimulate demand, which is investment in infrastructure. By investing in infrastructure, by spending a lot on public works, you end up creating employment that puts money in the hands of people. As you actually develop infrastructure, the infrastructure makes it cheaper to do business, it makes it more efficient to do business, and through that expenditure, you end up indirectly stimulating demand more widely in the economy. And I think that's the approach that's been taken in this last year. It's the right way of actually going about stimulating demand. I think any other measures, tax cuts and so on, are not such a good idea. They're more expensive and they're less efficient.
Right. I have a bunch of very interesting and solid questions from the audience. Let me draw them in now. One of the questions anybody can raise a hand on this. This crisis has exposed real issues around social security, healthcare, pollution, etc. But most importantly, the culture of non-accountability at all levels. Something which we have, which you can feel when people are expressing their views across platforms. What can be done to solve this? Manish, if I may.
Yeah, good.
The issue of non-accountability at all levels. The crisis has exposed issues such as social security, healthcare, scarcity, pollution. Mr. Siddharth Singh. Sorry, please go ahead, Manish. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Please go ahead, Manish.
I think COVID has exposed pre-existing conditions. Of the Indian economy. I think it's not created any new conditions. So there are India is inadequately formalized, urbanized, industrialized, financialized, and skilled. So I'm a little surprised when people are expressing shock at what's going on. The Indian bank, the Indian COP, the Indian hospital has behaved exactly as you would expect them to behave, right? Let's not pretend we're a rich country. We have watched with jealousy the US fiscal deficit this year is more than our GDP. So if we want to have those kind of resources, then we have to really recognize where resources come from. And it comes from all three legs. It comes from civil society, it comes from a functioning government, and it comes from a vibrant private sector. So I would say I'm not sure lack of accountability is why India has its challenges. I think that, we obviously made some wrong assumptions when we started off after independence. The 1955 Avadi Resolution and the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan were not exactly conducive to private sector. You kneecapped the private sector. I think 1991 was important, but it was incomplete. It didn't cover education. It did not cover banking. It did not cover healthcare. And just deregulation of the license Raj fixed the sins of commission, what we were doing wrong, but it didn't fix the sins of omission. So I would submit that if there was one binding constraint for the next 20 years, it would be civil service reform. And I can cover that in detail, but I'll let Naushad take it from here.
So, to address your question on accountability, Vaidhi, I would make the argument that I think accountability comes from many agencies holding those in power to account. That includes the media. I think the Indian Express in India and the FT reporting from India have been very honorable exceptions in this last period where they have been holding the government to account. I think many other media groups have failed in playing the part that you would expect them to in holding the government to account, both state governments and union government. I think if you take institutions of state, some institutions of state have performed okay, but many have tended not to play the role that they're expected to as independent, well-performing institutions of state. And we should ask the question of why they have not done their jobs, as one would expect. There was today a message from the Supreme Court to the Election Commission of India, asking them why they did not act as they needed to stop unsafe gatherings in the current state election campaigns. And it's a good question, and it should have been asked a month ago. So I think there are many such examples of institutions that need to play their role. And if we all play our role in an effective way, then we end up building much greater accountability of those in power.
Shobna, on this issue of institutions and the roles that they play, how do you look at it? In terms of say various institutions that India has, be it the judiciary, be it the of course the legislature, be it the election commission, be it the Reserve Bank of India, in terms of say holding its forth, holding its independence, and taking its own decisions. What has been your observation?
I think this last couple of years has been a challenge on all fronts, but it also has been a challenging time in history. So I do think that when you spoke about accountability, everyone would be accountable if they were given a script and a game plan. So I think that we need to hold ourselves to those high standards, and we have to re-understand them. And then you'll find that some are doing it right, some are doing it. So when Manish said redo the civil system, go the whole hog, of everything, and then question it. Let's make sure. But at this time, we're not in a position to do this. I think that we also have to figure out that the best moves are successful when the timing is right. Right now, the timing stands. There's so many more priorities. So I would think that what society has come out as being humanitarian is much more than anything else. So in every phase that, whether it's the government opening up vaccinations, that to me was humanitarian. Stopping exports, Atmanirbhar, or saying that we'll spend more and take this. So when the RBI held the rates, so maybe they had these considerations required to be done. And there was definitely some honesty in this budget. So I do commend the budget also. So we can't say that everything here is wrong. And if it's wrong, then we're also the cause of it. And why am I living here? But so I'm committed, and I think that Indians. So we'll just work on these things. But right now, we need to get over this COVID. To me, very focused healthcare. I need to get over this problem.
Yeah, Mr. Singh, there's a question directed at you. About when Supreme Court having stayed these farm laws for the moment. How is it that the Uttar Pradesh government or other states are going ahead with implementation of these laws?
Well, Supreme Court has not stayed these laws. They're certainly not. They gave an offer that to the central government, but not to the state government. The state governments are within their own jurisdiction. They said that you can stay these laws and think about it, but let those who are agitating, they come around and have a discussion with the center. But that was nothing that we agreed to. That the center did agree to it. So certainly it wasn't a kind of a ban coming from the Supreme Court. But at the same time, I go back to a previous question. I'll just make a small comment. I think as Indians, we are too judgmental. We really want to pass a judgment on everything. Individually, trust me, if we all look in what we have done or what we should have done, I don't see any one of us will be spared in us, answering that question and saying, yes, I could have done that. And that brings in us the responsibility. Everybody talks about the Constitution. They talk about this is my right, this is my right. Nobody talks about their responsibility. Constitution does speak about your own responsibility. So I personally feel if we leave that habit, perhaps, and secondly, I will definitely agree as a minister, civil servants reform, civil administrative reform is a need of the hour. It should be brought in. Everything these civil servants can do, trust me, that's not a good sign. When the We really want to reach $5 trillion? No. We need good experts, those who are from that field to advise us, run things much, much better, advise us much better, and then government can formulate laws, reforms, introduce, and make responsible. And it should come now in this administrative reform. If we are giving you the responsibility, the accountability also lies with you. You don't keep getting the promotions.
Yeah, I think that's a debate which will carry on for a longer time on rights versus responsibilities. Thank you so much, panelists, and for a wonderful illuminating session. I would also like to thank our lead sponsor, Maharashtra Industrial Development Corporation, and our associate sponsor, One District, One Product, Uttar Pradesh. Thank you, audience. Thank you for being and staying with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Giles, Economics Editor of the Financial Times, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Lord Jerry Grimstone, the UK's Minister for Investment. He's based both at the Department for International Trade and the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department. Lord Grimstone, I'll call you Jerry if I may. It's wonderful you could join us today at our conference on India's quest for economic power. And I'm sure the audience is really keen to hear your thoughts on the potential for greater economic partnership between the UK and India. If I may start this week with the visit to India by the Prime Minister, which has now unfortunately had to be cancelled due to COVID. The FT reported last week that the PM wants to or the UK wants to more than double trade with India by 2030. Can you give us a sense of how realistic this objective is? Given that UK's exports to India have been falling in recent years?
Yes, certainly. Well, thanks, Chris. First of all, pleased to say that the meeting has not been cancelled; it's been postponed, and there will be, some interaction virtually with the meeting. And I know the PM is looking forward very much to getting out there. And of course, we've all got the deepest sympathy for the issues that are facing India at the moment on the pandemic. Look, I know India very well. I've been there well over 50 times. My previous incarnation, I ran one of the largest global investors in India. And I've always seen India as, despite the huge amount we do with them at the moment, as being a bit of an unfulfilled promise. I mean, the extent of the present relationship is really extraordinary. I mean, 1 in 50 people in the United Kingdom are overseas Indian. We've got 850 Indian companies in the UK. These are latest figures from Grant Thornton from this morning, employing over 116,000 employees. So there's a huge amount of activity that goes on between India and the UK. Having said that, there are barriers in our trade. So I'm sure that with goodwill on both sides, if we can move down the pathway of a free trade agreement, the mere act of removing some of those barriers, I've got no doubt will have a huge impact on trade.
What do you think are the key steps that need to be taken to make greater trade, greater economic partnerships happen and a closer partnership?
I mean, basically, look, it's working through what you have to do to get a modern, comprehensive free trade agreement. And, and let's just remind our listeners that there's much, much more nowadays to free trade agreements than the movement of goods or the movement of or tariffs. They cover services, they cover digital business, they cover SMEs. So there's a huge amount of content in a free trade agreement. As you know, the EU has been trying unsuccessfully to negotiate a free trade agreement with India for over the last 10, 15 years or so. So I'm very hopeful that now we're an independent trading nation and we can do things ourselves, we'll be able to really, get a move on with this when the time is right.
Do you see a full free trading or comprehensive free trading agreement as a legitimate and a viable ambition, or something a little bit more limited at first on which we can build over time?
I think the nature of these things is that you start where you can, and then you build over time. Look, the Secretary of Trade, Liz Truss, had a very successful meeting in India earlier this year with her counterpart, and I think the kind of feeling coming out of that meeting was very positive. The two ministers agreed at that point on what they called an enhanced trade partnership to deepen our trade relationship and remove barriers to trade and investment. And both of them saw, this would create a pathway which should allow us to do a potential future FTA. I don't want to put timing on that. These things obviously take time to do. More important to do them properly than to rush them. But I think that the possibility of a UK-India free trade agreement, frankly, is higher now than it ever has been.
Now, it was leaked in the FT last week that the UK's primary offensive aims in any initial free trade agreement with India was for the automotive sector and the whiskey sector. What is it that we would be willing to give up in return for that, or where are the compromises likely to be available?
You understand, despite the efforts of the Financial Times to publicise our negotiating strategy, any negotiating strategy in a free trade agreement has to be put together discreetly. But look, we know that India has got interest in expanding its access to the UK market in a number of sectors, agri-food to pharmaceuticals. We can see great opportunities for services in India, for some of our professional qualifications to be valid in India, a number of other matters. But I think it's one of these cases, which is why I think it will progress when the time is right, that liberalising trade will benefit both our economies. How we go about these things, as you know, we do a deep consultation with UK business before we launch negotiations, and then once we get that sort of insights from UK businesses, that's when we'll put together our negotiating strategy.
What is it that you think the UK can really offer India in terms of helping India to make a bigger mark in the global economy? So not necessarily giving things access to the UK market, but the way that we can maybe work together for benefit to both economies?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, but the fact is India and the UK work very closely together at the moment. India is the world's largest democracy. We are the world's oldest democracy, and our interests coincide in many areas. India is a very easy place for us to interact with, and Indians find it very easy interacting here. And the nice thing about it is that it's a partnership of equals. And all the meetings ever I've been in, I've accompanied the last 4 prime ministers of India, and every single meeting I've been in has always been very positive about what the two countries can do together. And I now think we're reaching a state where some of that kind of promise of the past will be able to be turned into an actual deal, an actual arrangement.
What is it, therefore, that, given that trade hasn't really expanded very strongly with India over the past decade, what's been the impediment, given that relationships are, as you say, have been pretty good? What's stopped more business being done, do you think?
It's a good. I mean, it's a good question. Look, India is a complicated country. It's a country where you need to understand it to make an impression on it. I think the growth of e-commerce in India has played to, certainly it's meant that SMEs in England with branded goods, brands that the Indians like, have found it much easier to access the Indian market. I've always felt with India that the companies who know it, the British companies who know it and operate there, do very well out of it. Companies who don't know it don't do business there. So part of the advantage of moving down the track we are is opening people's eyes to what the possibilities are in India. And I always say that free trade agreements in themselves are fine. But what you really have to do then is to operationalize them, to bring home to British businesses, large, medium and small, how can they use these agreements to export more to India.
And so do you think there's a real scope for improving the economic partnership, even if there isn't a formal free trade agreement between the two countries?
Yes, I think so. Look, these things have got steps, and as you go down this pathway, each step yields benefits for both countries. And what does that then encourage? It encourages another step to be taken. But look, I really personally feel optimistic about this. I think this pathway, which hopefully the Prime Minister will be able to start carving out, when they meet, will really lead to somewhere eventually on this.
Great. The UK is not alone in making overtures to India, particularly on the European continent. The FT reported yesterday that the EU and India are seeking to build joint infrastructure projects around the world, in particular competing with China's Belt and Road initiative. To what extent do you see this, the EU's overtures to India, as an opportunity for the UK and for India to maybe join forces and take part in this, or as a threat to the UK?
Well, I mean, so prior to this announcement this week, we've always been, working closely with India in the infrastructure space. A number of UK investors, of course, are very, very interested in there. Concession finance is something that we're very interested in talking to with the Indian government. We've been given support to infrastructure over the years. I think the EU initiative is a great initiative. But like all these initiatives, it'll be interesting to see what it actually produces on the ground. Chris, you know better than I do. There's sometimes a bit of a distance between, announcing the initiative and the cars driving down over the first bridge, which comes from it.
No, absolutely. That's the same can be said, of course, for free trade agreements. That often they make a huge splash in newspapers like ours, and then the actual effect of them on the ground can sometimes be less large, at least in the short term. But part of the whole process of this is diplomacy, and the UK has opened and invited India, along with Australia and South Korea, to the G7 summit this summer in Cornwall in June. What do you like to get out of that? What do you see that role is? Why has the UK invited India? What can be achieved there?
Well, it's a courtesy extended to whoever is the chair of the G7, to invite a few observer countries along to it. We thought it would give rise to some very interesting discussions, having India present. Now, again, I think I see it as something, in a way, no more, no less than a manifestation of the very strong partnership that we have with India. They are a natural country for us to invite. I think the Indo-Pacific region is becoming increasingly important. I think that India, is exerting itself more on the international trade, on the international stage. we welcome that. We do things in concert with India. We like doing things with India. So they're a natural person to invite to the G7. We are having, for the first time at this G7, there is going to be a trade, what we call a trade track, associated with the G7, and that's a G7 trade track. So the Trade Secretary of this trust will be holding meetings of the G7 trade ministers while they're here. And I think it's just part of the indication that now we control our own trade policy. Trade policy and attracting investment have become two very important things in the UK. It's absolutely part of what we see as our economic bounce back, after COVID. And we have to put some effort into it, which is what we're doing. I want us to be much more muscular and entrepreneurial when we do this, and there's no better partner to be working with on this than India.
And is the partnership with India in some ways, what is one of the benefits as far as the UK sees it, that we'll be dealing with another very large Asian economy and maybe in some words countering China's strategic ambitions in the region and ensuring that we have another very large Asian player to partner with?
Well, look, it's not as if India is a new partner for us. We've always partnered in India. I mean, we have such close relationships between the two countries. I don't see that there's a trade-off between India and China. They are both very large countries, and we trade with both of them. And we're great proponents of global trade, but we're really looking to develop this with India going forward.
Joe, one final question. The UK is clearly trying to look further afield now it's left the European Union. To what extent is the partnership we're seeking to build with India a reflection, as what you said was, I think, to have a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific region?
We are a global nation. I think, for the 3 or 4 years running up to exiting the European Union, I think we became a bit too internalized. I think we were arguing amongst ourselves. I have to say that I have never known greater interest in investing in the UK than we have now, because I think what you're seeing is, Britain, forging its own way, building its own relationships with these people, and looking to secure mutual advantage in the whole trade and investment space from this.
Thank you very much, Jerry Grimstone. Thank you, Lord Grimstone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it was a fantastic kind of panel discussion, kicking off with the finance minister's interview. I think there was a broad sense that, we are in the midst of COVID and it's a very bad second wave. But, there was some sense of moderation from what the finance minister said, that, all the major reform agendas that were put in place during the budget, announced in the budget, and over the last 12-14 months, they will be on track. So that's something which was, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that was something which was there were lots of concerns about a national lockdown, about whether there'll be large scale migrant movements. I think she laid to rest that speculation, at least in this, giving that confidence to the industry, stating that there won't be a national lockdown and states will go ahead with their micro containment zones. and they are all doing their best to kind of prevent such a large scale movement of people from the urban cities to back to their homes and rural areas. I think that was something which kind of probably comforted the industry. But of course, the crisis at hand, she did say that be it oxygen cylinders, be it drugs like remdesivir, or even hospital beds, I think states are trying to do their best. That seems to be the immediate concern. So that came out pretty strongly in her interview. And one interesting thing which has a kind of impact on Indian economy in a globalized world is on protectionism. I think that she kind of tried her best to kind of give a sense of what she means by Atmanirbharta and self-reliance, where she says that it's about building or enhancing domestic capacities, and that the government is cognizant of the fact that they don't want to get regressive with this.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious that the world is paying a lot of attention to India right now. And as my colleague Martin Wolf said, the world is actually rooting for India to succeed. It's interesting because sometimes that's not the narrative here domestically, is that there's this idea that the world is trying to hold India back. And I think, as Martin kind of said, maybe not as strongly, but I heard him clearly say, Western countries want to see India succeed economically. And there's obviously a lot of challenges, many of which predate the pandemic, which will have to be tackled with. I was also very struck by the chief economic advisor's comments, KV Subramaniam, who spoke about a new attitude towards business. He said that there's like a positive attitude towards private capital, which is obviously a big shift from a kind of a traditional anti-business sentiment, a suspicion of private capital, suspicion of private business. I mean, one thing is whether, the talk of, we value our private sector and our private sector is so important to growth, whether that is really matched by the actions on the ground, whether the actions on the ground and the policies that the government is adopting really reflects an attitude of support for the private sector, and whether private investors really feel like that. So it's obviously going to be a very, very dynamic period for India, and a lot of things to tackle, starting with the pandemic, but then moving on to very serious economic reform issues. So I think we've had a lot to think about and hear tonight from a variety of speakers, and I think it's been absolutely fascinating. And I guess probably it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, absolutely. So some of the issues, one or two issues which struck to me were, of course, this bit about accountability in times of crisis, whether the agencies or the institutions are doing the work well. I think that is something which has kept the people concerned. And also some of the red flags that Martin raised about, India deglobalizing, or, public debt being a high percentage of GDP today. I think those are issues which I think everybody seems to be pretty concerned about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Vedi. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you and putting this together.
Yeah, same here. Amy, thanks a lot to all our viewers who are watching. A reminder that all the sessions will be available on demand on the event website for the next 1 month or 30 days. Just in case you missed anything or would like to watch some of these sessions again, please do share your thoughts and tweets on social media using Post-Pandemic India.
And I'd also like to remind everybody to please register for the second event in our series, India, China, and the US, a new geopolitical landscape, which is taking place on May 20th. We're very, very honored that India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, is going to be joining us for a keynote interview. And given, all the drama that India and China have had, and the very complicated triangle of relations between India, China, and the US, it's sure to be a fascinating session.
Yeah, we have a stellar panel there as well. It promises to be another fascinating event. With that, it's good evening from India. See you all again next month in May.
Good night, everyone, and thanks very much.